Across the span of 3,000 years, the peoples of the ancient Near Eastern Europe would transform a peculiar greenish stone into the foundation of human technological civilization, extracting copper from the earth through processes that required temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, establishing trade networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic coast, constructing settlements whose populations reached into the thousands, developing social hierarchies that would persist in recognizable forms for millennia, and creating the metallurgical traditions that would eventually give rise to bronze, iron, and every metalworking technology that followed. The copper that emerged from Anatolian highlands and Iranian plateau workshops would travel hundreds of kilometers to reach communities that had never seen the ore from which it came, while the knowledge required to produce it would spread across linguistic and cultural boundaries through mechanisms that scholars still struggle to fully comprehend. The transformation of human society that accompanied this metal's adoption touched every aspect of existence, from the organization of labor to the nature of warfare, from the structure of religious practice to the distribution of wealth and power within communities that had previously known only the relative egalitarianism of Neolithic village life. But in the centuries before 5000 BCE, when the first metalworkers began their experiments with native copper nuggets in the highlands of eastern Anatolia, the communities that would eventually master smelting technology possessed no conception of the transformations their descendants would accomplish. The villages scattered across the Taurus Mountains and the Zagros Ranges contained populations that measured their wealth in grain stores and livestock, that organized their social lives around kinship networks extending back generations, that understood the world through cosmological frameworks shaped by agricultural cycles and the movements of celestial bodies. The stone tools that dominated their material culture represented technologies refined over hundreds of thousands of years, achieving forms so perfectly adapted to their functions that many would persist alongside metal implements for millennia after copper working became widespread. The world these communities inhabited was one of profound continuity with the deep Neolithic past, a world in which the revolutionary potential of metallurgy remained entirely invisible. This is the story of the Chalcolithic transformation, the Copper Age that bridged the final millennia of the Stone Age and the dawn of Bronze Age civilization. From the earliest cold hammering of native copper in the highlands, where Anatolia meets the Iranian plateau, through the revolutionary discovery of smelting that would make copper production independent of the rare native metal deposits, across the rise of Tel Halaf, Ubaid and Vinča cultures, whose sophisticated ceramic traditions and expanding settlement hierarchies would reshape the social landscape of 3 continents, into the proto-urban centres of the Levantine corridor, where some of the earliest experiments in complex social organisation took place, to the frozen Alpine Pass where Ötzi the Iceman fell with his copper axe some 5,000 years ago, and onward to the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles, where copper working traditions would take distinctive local forms that scholars continue to study for their implications regarding the mechanisms of technological and cultural transmission. The journey concludes at the threshold of the Bronze Age, when the deliberate alloying of copper with tin or arsenic created materials whose properties exceeded those of pure copper and inaugurated a new chapter in human technological development. The geological circumstances that made copper available to early metalworkers reflected processes operating across hundreds of millions of years. The deep time transformations of the Earth's crust that concentrated particular elements in accessible deposits. Native copper, the metallic form that occurs naturally without requiring extraction from ore, represented an extremely rare geological phenomenon, found primarily in regions where specific conditions of volcanic activity, groundwater chemistry and erosional exposure combined to produce nuggets and sheets of pure metal that required no processing beyond physical manipulation. The highlands of eastern Anatolia, where the Taurus Mountains meet the Armenian Plateau, contained some of the most significant native copper deposits in the ancient Near East, while the Iranian Plateau, particularly the regions around the modern borders of Iran, Turkey and Iraq, offered additional sources that would attract human attention as early as the 8th millennium BCE. The distribution of these deposits would shape the geography of early metallurgy, creating centres of innovation in regions whose subsequent historical importance derived in part from their early access to metal resources. The communities that first encountered native copper possessed no framework for understanding the material's distinctive properties, no conceptual category that distinguished metals from the stones and minerals that otherwise dominated their toolkit. The reddish-gold colour of fresh native copper surfaces, the malleability that allowed the material to be shaped through hammering without fracturing, the capacity to take and hold an edge that exceeded that of most stones, the unusual weight that distinguished copper from similarly coloured minerals, all these properties would eventually mark copper as a material category distinct from stone. But the recognition of this distinction required extended experience with the substance and the gradual development of techniques specific to its manipulation. The earliest interactions between human communities and native copper probably involved treatment of the material as simply another variety of attractive stone, suitable for beads and ornaments that could be produced through the same grinding and polishing techniques applied to serpentine, malachite, and other decorative minerals. Archaeological evidence suggests that native copper was being collected and worked in the Near East by at least 9000 BCE, though the scale of this activity remained extremely limited, and the techniques employed did not yet exploit the distinctive properties that would eventually make copper so valuable. The transition from treating copper as an ornamental stone to recognizing it as a workable metal with unique properties represented one of the most significant cognitive shifts in human technological history, a transformation in understanding that required the development of entirely new techniques and concepts. The key insight that distinguished metalworking from stoneworking was the recognition that copper could be repeatedly heated and hammered without losing its integrity, that the material possessed a capacity for reshaping that stones fundamentally lacked. When a flint knapper struck a stone to produce a flake, the removal was permanent, the original form irretrievably altered by each blow. When a metalworker struck a copper nugget, the material deformed rather than fractured, spreading and thinning under repeated impacts while maintaining its structural continuity. This property, which modern metallurgists understand in terms of crystalline structure and atomic bonding, would have appeared to ancient craftspeople as a form of behaviour that set copper apart from every other material in their experience, a substance that responded to human manipulation in ways that seemed almost organic in their capacity for transformation. The techniques of cold hammering that characterized the earliest copperworking exploited this malleability without requiring any understanding of the thermal processes that would eventually revolutionize metallurgy. A craftsperson working with a native copper nugget in the 6th millennium BCE could produce beads, pendants, pins, and small tools simply by hammering the material into desired shapes, using stone anvils and hammers that differed little from the tools employed in other craft activities. The process required patience and skill, as excessive hammering without annealing would cause the copper to become brittle and crack, but the basic techniques were accessible to any community that possessed native copper and the motivation to experiment with its properties. The objects produced through these methods appeared across a wide geographic range during the 7th and 6th millennia BCE, from the Levantine coast to the Iranian highlands, though the quantities remained small and the applications limited primarily to ornamental rather than utilitarian functions. The true transformation of copper from a curiosity to a foundational technology would require the development of smelting, a process that demanded far more sophisticated understanding and infrastructure than cold working of native metal. The geography of the ancient Near East during the 6th and 5th millennia BCE shaped the contexts within which metallurgical experimentation took place, creating conditions that favoured innovation in some regions while limiting it in others. The alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, which would eventually become the heartland of Bronze Age civilization, possessed essentially no metal resources of any kind. Their deep sedimentary deposits containing only the clays, silts, and organic materials carried down by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers over millions of years. The communities that established themselves in these fertile lowlands during the Ubaid period, beginning around 6500 BCE and continuing through the 5th millennium, would eventually become major consumers of copper and other metals, but their access to these materials depended entirely upon trade networks extending into the resource-rich highlands that surrounded Mesopotamia on three sides. The Anatolian plateau to the north and west, the Zagros Mountains to the east, and the Taurus Mountains that divided Anatolia from the Levantine corridor all contained significant mineral deposits, including copper ores that would eventually support large-scale smelting operations. But these regions also presented the challenges of difficult terrain, limited agricultural potential, and populations that remained relatively sparse compared to the rapidly growing lowland settlements. The cultural landscape of the 5th millennium BCE across the Near East and southeastern Europe presented a mosaic of distinct traditions whose interactions would shape the development of metallurgical technology. The Tel Halaf culture, which flourished across northern Mesopotamia and parts of eastern Anatolia from approximately 6100 to 5100 BCE, produced some of the most sophisticated painted pottery of the ancient world, elaborate polychrome vessels whose decorative programs drew upon geometric and naturalistic motifs, arranged in complex compositions that suggest highly developed aesthetic traditions and possibly symbolic systems that remain only partially understood. The Halafian settlement pattern, characterized by small villages distributed across the rainfall agriculture zone of northern Mesopotamia, created conditions favorable to experimentation with local resources, including the copper ores available in the highland margins of the Halafian world. While direct evidence for Halafian copper smelting remains limited, the culture's sophisticated craft traditions and its geographic position at the interface between lowland agricultural zones and highland mineral resources positioned it as a potential contributor to early metallurgical development. The Ubaid culture that gradually expanded across southern Mesopotamia during the 6th and 5th millennia BCE represented a different trajectory of social development, one that emphasized large-scale settlement organization and the beginnings of monumental architecture that would eventually characterize Mesopotamian civilization. The Ubaid period witnessed the establishment of settlements that approached proto-urban scale, with populations measuring in the hundreds or low thousands and organizational complexity that exceeded anything previously seen in the region. The characteristic Ubaid pottery, with its distinctive painted decoration featuring geometric motifs in dark paint on light backgrounds, spread far beyond the Mesopotamian heartland, reaching the Persian Gulf coast, the Arabian Peninsula, and portions of the Anatolian plateau through mechanisms that scholars continue to debate. Whether the spread of Ubaid material culture represented actual population movements, the adoption of prestige goods by local elites, or more complex processes of cultural transmission, its geographic extent demonstrated the growing interconnection of communities across the ancient Near East during precisely the period when metallurgical technology was developing. The Ubaid communities themselves produced little copper, given their location in the metal-poor alluvium, but their demand for exotic materials, including metals, would eventually drive the expansion of trade networks that brought copper from highland sources to lowland consumers. The Vinča culture of the Central Balkans represented yet another trajectory of Chalcolithic development, one that would produce some of the earliest evidence for copper smelting anywhere in the world, centered in the region of modern Serbia. With extensions into Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary and Croatia, the Vinča culture flourished from approximately 5,700 to 4,500 BCE, creating large settlements with populations that may have reached several thousand individuals, sophisticated ceramic traditions that included elaborate ritual vessels and figurines, and metallurgical practices that by the 5th millennium BCE included the smelting of copper from ore rather than simple working of native metal. The Vinča site itself, located on the banks of the Danube near modern Belgrade, contained evidence of copper working dating to the mid-5th millennium BCE, while related sites in the Eastern Balkans, particularly in Bulgaria, have yielded some of the earliest definitive evidence for copper smelting in the Old World. The Ebuna mine complex in Bulgaria, which was actively exploited during the 5th millennium BCE, represents one of the oldest known mining operations specifically targeting copper ore rather than native metal, suggesting that Balkan communities had developed the full suite of techniques required for ore extraction, processing and smelting by this early date. The development of copper smelting represented a technological breakthrough of the first order, requiring understanding and control of processes that operated far beyond the parameters of any previous human technology. The transformation of copper ore into metallic copper demanded temperatures approaching 1200 degrees Celsius, sustained for extended periods in reducing atmospheres that could strip oxygen from the copper oxide or copper sulfide minerals that constituted the ore. Achieving these temperatures required purpose-built furnaces capable of containing intense heat, fuel supplies adequate to maintain high temperatures for hours at a time, and bellows or other devices to force air through the combustion zone at rates sufficient to generate the required energy. The reducing atmosphere necessary for successful smelting required careful control of the ratio between fuel and air, creating conditions in which carbon monoxide predominated over carbon dioxide and could therefore strip oxygen from the ore. None of these requirements was trivial, and the development of the knowledge and infrastructure necessary to meet them represented a substantial investment of social resources over extended periods of experimentation and refinement. The question of where and when copper smelting first developed has generated extensive scholarly debate, with strong cases made for both the Near Eastern highlands and the Balkan region as potential centres of innovation. The traditional model, which emphasised the Near East as the cradle of metallurgical technology, pointed to the region's longer history of copper, working through cold hammering techniques and its rich deposits of both native copper and copper ore as factors that would have favoured early development of smelting. However, the archaeological evidence from the Balkans, particularly from Bulgarian sites such as those in the Ibuna mining district and the settlement at Varna, has demonstrated that southeastern European communities were engaging in sophisticated copper production by at least the mid-5th millennium BCE, contemporaneous with, or possibly earlier than definitive evidence for smelting in the Near East. The possibility that copper smelting was invented independently in multiple locations rather than spreading from a single point of origin has gained increasing acceptance among scholars, reflecting broader recognition that complex technologies often emerge through parallel processes in regions where appropriate conditions exist. The social implications of copper metallurgy extended far beyond the technical processes of extraction and production, reshaping the organisation of communities that adopted the new technology and creating new forms of social differentiation that would eventually characterise Bronze Age societies. The production of copper required specialised knowledge that could not be easily acquired through casual observation, creating opportunities for craft specialists to establish distinct social positions based on their technical expertise. The control of access to copper ore deposits, which were geographically restricted to particular highland regions, created conditions for the emergence of exchange networks through which communities lacking local resources could obtain metal in exchange for other goods. The durability and value of copper objects made them suitable for accumulation and display, enabling individuals and families to manifest their wealth and status through possession of metal items in ways that had not been possible with more perishable or readily available materials. All these factors contributed to processes of social stratification that would accelerate dramatically during the 4th millennium BCE, as copper production increased in scale and the foundations were laid for Bronze Age urban civilization. The archaeological record of the 5th millennium BCE across the Near Eastern Europe reveals the gradual proliferation of copper objects through contexts that illuminate the social significance attached to the new material. The Varna cemetery in Bulgaria, dating to the middle of the 5th millennium BCE, contained burials with spectacular gold and copper grave goods that demonstrated profound inequality in access to metal resources. One burial, designated Grave 43, contained an adult male interred with more than 3 kilograms of gold objects, along with copper implements including axes and other tools, quantities of exotic materials that far exceeded anything found in the hundreds of other burials at the site. The existence of such extreme concentrations of wealth in a 5th millennium context challenges earlier assumptions about the relatively egalitarian nature of Chalcolithic societies, suggesting that processes of social stratification had progressed much further by this date than scholars had previously recognised. The metal objects from Varna and related sites demonstrate technical sophistication in both production and design, indicating that Balkan metallurgists had achieved mastery of their craft by this early period. The environmental conditions of the 5th and 4th millennia BCE provided the backdrop against which these social and technological transformations unfolded, shaping the possibilities available to communities across the ancient world. The climate of the Chalcolithic period was generally favourable for agriculture across the Near Eastern Europe, with precipitation patterns and temperature regimes that supported the expansion of farming populations into regions that had previously been only marginally suitable for cultivation. The population growth that accompanied this agricultural expansion created demand for resources of all kinds, including the exotic materials such as copper that were beginning to enter long-distance exchange networks. The forest that still covered substantial portions of the Near Eastern Europe provided the fuel necessary for metallurgical operations, though the enormous quantities of charcoal required for sustained smelting activities would eventually contribute to deforestation processes that transformed regional landscapes. The rivers and coastal waters that connected highland resource zones with lowland population centres enabled the movement of heavy materials such as copper ore and finished metal objects across distances that would have been impractical for overland transport, facilitating the development of exchange systems that linked environmentally diverse regions into increasingly integrated economic networks. The communities of the Levantine corridor during the 5th and 4th millennia BCE occupied a geographic position that placed them at the intersection of multiple cultural and economic networks, creating conditions favourable for the adoption and adaptation of metallurgical technologies developed in neighbouring regions. The Levant, stretching from the Mediterranean coast through the Jordan Valley and extending into the northern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, contained limited copper resources of its own, but possessed agricultural potential and strategic location that made it a natural zone of interaction between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the maritime networks of the eastern Mediterranean. The settlement of Tel Eilat Gassul in the Jordan Valley, which gives its name to the Gasulian culture of the 4th millennium BCE, demonstrated the sophisticated craft production and apparent social complexity that characterized Levantine communities during this period. The elaborate wall paintings discovered at Gasulian sites, featuring geometric and possibly narrative compositions executed in multiple colors, suggest communities with sufficient surplus to support specialized artistic production and with cosmological or ideological frameworks that found expression through visual media. The spread of copper working across the Levant during the 4th millennium BCE created new possibilities for craft production and social differentiation in communities that had previously relied entirely upon stone, bone, and ceramic materials. The copper objects that began appearing in Levantine archaeological contexts during this period included tools such as axes and chisels, weapons including mace heads and daggers, and ornamental items that demonstrated the versatility of the new material. The sources of the copper that reached Levantine communities remained diverse, with metal potentially arriving from Anatolian highlands to the north, from the Sinai Peninsula and eastern desert regions of Egypt to the south and west, and from sources in the Arabian Peninsula that were beginning to be exploited during this period. The technical knowledge required to work copper, whether through cold hammering of traded finished goods or through local casting of objects from imported raw metal, spread through mechanisms that remain only partially understood, possibly involving the movement of craftspeople themselves or the transmission of knowledge through commercial and diplomatic networks. The proto-urban developments of the 4th millennium BCE in regions surrounding the Near Eastern highlands represented the culmination of processes that had been building throughout the Chalcolithic period, creating settlements whose scale, organizational complexity, and material culture anticipated the urban civilizations that would emerge during the following millennium. The site of Arslan Tepe in eastern Turkey, which would reach its greatest extent during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, demonstrated the integration of metallurgical production into systems of political and economic organization that exceeded the capabilities of village-scale societies. The copper and arsenical bronze objects recovered from Arslan Tepe, including swords and other weapons of unprecedented sophistication, suggested specialized production under elite control and participation in exchange networks that connected the site to both Mesopotamian and Anatolian spheres of influence. The emergence of such centers pointed toward the fundamental transformation that would characterize the transition from Chalcolithic to Bronze Age societies, the development of institutions capable of mobilizing labor and resources on scales that dwarfed anything achieved by earlier communities. The technical development of copper metallurgy during the 4th millennium BCE proceeded through incremental improvements in understanding and control of the production process, gradually expanding the range of objects that could be produced and the consistency of their quality. The recognition that certain copper ores, particularly those containing arsenic as a natural impurity, produced metal with superior hardness and casting properties, represented an important step toward the deliberate alloying that would characterize Bronze Age metallurgy. Arsenical copper, which appeared in archaeological contexts across the Near Eastern Europe from the mid-4th millennium BCE onward, demonstrated the beginning of metallurgical experimentation with alloy composition, even though the addition of arsenic probably remained unintentional in most cases during this early period. The health hazards associated with arsenic exposure during smelting operations, which would have caused chronic illness among metalworkers who regularly processed arsenical ores, may have contributed to the social marginalization of metallurgical specialists that appears in later textual and archaeological evidence. though the connection remains speculative for the Chalcolithic period. The mechanisms through which metallurgical knowledge spread across the ancient Near East and Europe during the Chalcolithic period remain subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation, with competing models emphasizing different combinations of population movement, technological diffusion, and independent innovation. The movement of craftspeople carrying specialized knowledge from one community to another provided one obvious pathway for technological transmission, and archaeological evidence for population movements during the 4th millennium BCE suggests that such mobility was common across substantial distances. The spread of distinctive ceramic styles, burial practices, and architectural traditions across regions that lacked obvious geographic connections demonstrates that cultural elements could travel through mechanisms that did not require wholesale population replacement, suggesting that technological knowledge might similarly spread through networks of exchange and interaction. The possibility of independent invention in multiple regions, supported by the evidence for early metallurgical development in both the Near East and the Balkans, implies that communities with access to appropriate resources and sufficient motivation to experiment might develop smelting technology without direct transmission from external sources. The 4th millennium BCE witnessed the expansion of copper, working into regions increasingly distant from the primary centers of metallurgical innovation, carrying the new technology into environmental and social contexts quite different from those where it first developed. The Iberian Peninsula, separated from the Near Eastern heartland by thousands of kilometers of Mediterranean Sea and European continent, began receiving copper objects and eventually developing local metallurgical traditions during the 4th millennium, creating a Western European zone of metal production that would achieve considerable importance during the following millennia. The mechanisms through which metallurgical knowledge reached Iberia remain debated, with some scholars emphasizing maritime connections across the Mediterranean, while others point to overland routes through Central Europe as the primary vectors of transmission. The distinctive character of Iberian Chalcolithic cultures, with their fortified settlements, elaborate burial practices, and eventual development of sophisticated copper and gold working traditions, demonstrated that the adoption of metallurgy could proceed along trajectories quite different from those followed in the Near Eastern and Balkan regions where the technology had first emerged. The British Isles, even more distant from the centres of metallurgical innovation, would not receive copper working technology until near the end of the Chalcolithic period, with definitive evidence for local metal production appearing only in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. The communities that constructed Stonehenge and other great monument complexes of Neolithic Britain possessed sophisticated organisational capabilities and long-distance exchange connections, as demonstrated by the movement of massive stones across hundreds of kilometres and the presence of exotic materials in burial contexts, but they accomplished these feats without access to metal technology. The eventual arrival of copper working in Britain, probably through connections with continental European communities that were themselves receiving the technology from southeastern sources, would transform the material culture of the islands while building upon social structures that had developed entirely within a Neolithic framework. The transition from late Neolithic to early Bronze Age in Britain thus represented not simply the adoption of a new technology, but the integration of that technology into existing systems of social organisation and cultural practice that gave it distinctively local significance. The human dimensions of the Chalcolithic transformation found remarkable embodiment in the preserved remains of individuals who lived and died during this period of technological and social change, offering direct evidence of the ways that copper metallurgy entered individual experience. The discovery in 1991 of a naturally mummified body in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy provided unprecedented insight into the life of a Chalcolithic individual, a man who died approximately 5,300 years ago while crossing a high mountain pass, and whose body, clothing, and equipment were preserved by the glacial ice that covered him shortly after his death. The individual, whom researchers came to call Ötzi, carried with him a copper axe of sophisticated manufacture, the blade cast from nearly pure copper and hafted in a U-handle using leather bindings and birch tar adhesive. The axe represented one of the most advanced metallurgical products of its era, comparable to the finest examples known from contemporary archaeological contexts anywhere in Europe, and its presence among the possessions of an individual who appears to have been travelling alone through remote mountain terrain raised questions about the social distribution of valuable metal objects during this period. The examination of Ötzi's copper axe blade revealed metal of remarkable purity, with trace element analysis indicating copper derived from ores that most likely originated in sources south of the Alps, probably in the region of modern Tuscany, where copper deposits had attracted human attention since the early 4th millennium BCE. The casting technique employed in producing the blade demonstrated sophisticated understanding of metallurgical processes, with evidence suggesting that the copper had been melted and poured into a mould rather than simply cold-hammered from native metal, indicating that whoever produced the axe possessed the full range of pyrotechnical knowledge that smelting communities had developed over the preceding centuries. The shape of the blade itself conformed to typological patterns known from other Alpine and northern Italian finds of the same approximate period, suggesting that Ötzi's axe represented not an exceptional or unique object, but rather a standard product of established metallurgical traditions that had achieved considerable distribution throughout the region during the final centuries of the 4th millennium BCE. The hafting system that secured the blade to its wooden handle demonstrated equally sophisticated craftsmanship, with the yew-wood handle carved to create a knee-shaped bend that would have provided optimal mechanical advantage during use, while the leather bindings and birch tar adhesive created a secure attachment capable of withstanding the stresses of woodworking activities. The presence of such a valuable and technologically sophisticated object among the personal effects of an individual whose other possessions, while carefully crafted, suggested a life focused on practical activities rather than elite display, raised important questions about the social organisation of Chalcolithic Alpine communities. Ötzi's other equipment included a copper-bladed knife, a bow and arrows with flint points, a flint-bladed knife, containers made from birch bark, and clothing constructed from animal hides and plant fibres, all reflecting skills and resources consistent with a mobile lifestyle that exploited the diverse ecological zones of the Alpine environment. The radiocarbon dates obtained from Ötzi's remains and equipment placed his death in the period around 3300 BCE, making him roughly contemporary with the transition from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age in many regions, and situating his life within the period when copper metallurgy was spreading rapidly throughout temperate Europe, while the innovations that would characterize the Bronze Age proper were beginning to emerge in the Near East. The circumstances of Ötzi's death, which forensic analysis revealed to have resulted from an arrow wound to his back followed by a fatal blow to the head, suggested that violence between individuals or groups remained a persistent feature of Chalcolithic society despite the technological and social developments that the period witnessed. The genetic analysis of Ötzi's remains provided additional insights into the population dynamics of Chalcolithic Europe, revealing connections to early farming populations that had spread into Europe from Anatolia during the preceding millennia, while also showing evidence of admixture with indigenous European populations whose ancestors had inhabited the continent since the Paleolithic period. The individual represented by Ötzi's remains thus embodied in his very biology the population movements and interactions that had accompanied the spread of agriculture and subsequently of metallurgical technology throughout the European continent, making him a direct witness to the demographic transformations that characterized the transition from Mesolithic hunter-gatherer societies to the complex agricultural communities of the Chalcolithic period. The pathological analysis of Ötzi's remains revealed a lifetime of physical activity and various health challenges, including evidence of Lyme disease, intestinal parasites, and arthritis, conditions that reflected the demands and hazards of life in a Chalcolithic Alpine community, while also demonstrating the remarkable resilience that allowed individuals to survive and continue functioning despite chronic health problems. The broader context within which Ötzi lived and died encompassed a European continent that was undergoing profound transformations in settlement patterns, social organisation, and material culture during the final centuries of the 4th millennium BCE. The Chalcolithic cultures of the Alpine region, including the Finn culture of Switzerland and the Remodello culture of northern Italy, had developed distinctive traditions of copper working that drew upon both local and imported raw materials, while adapting metallurgical techniques to the specific environmental and social conditions of their mountainous homelands. The circulation of copper objects throughout the Alpine region and beyond demonstrated the existence of exchange networks that connected communities across considerable distances, allowing the products of specialized metallurgical workshops to reach individuals like Ötzi, who might themselves have possessed limited direct involvement in metal production. The standardization of axe forms and other copper objects across substantial geographic areas suggested that metallurgical production had begun to concentrate in specialized centers whose products achieved wide distribution through established trade relationships, a pattern of economic organization that would become increasingly characteristic of Bronze Age societies, but whose origins could already be detected in the Chalcolithic period. The Iberian Peninsula, which Ötzi never visited, and whose metallurgical traditions developed along trajectories quite independent of those followed in the Alpine region, was experiencing during the same period the consolidation of Chalcolithic cultures that would achieve remarkable sophistication during the 3rd millennium BCE. The distinctive character of Iberian Chalcolithic development reflected the peninsula's unique position at the western extremity of the Eurasian landmass, where Atlantic maritime environments, Mediterranean climatic conditions, and the rich mineral resources of regions such as the Rio Tinto Basin created circumstances quite different from those prevailing in either the Near Eastern heartland or the Central European zone. The communities that emerged in Iberia during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE developed fortified settlements of substantial size, constructed elaborate collective burial monuments, and eventually achieved sophisticated capabilities in both copper and gold working that placed Iberian metallurgy among the most advanced traditions of Chalcolithic Europe. The site of Los Millares in southeastern Spain exemplified the achievements of Iberian Chalcolithic society, with its massive stone fortifications, extensive settlement area, and associated cemetery containing numerous corbelled tombs that housed collective burials accompanied by grave goods including copper objects, ivory, and ostrich eggshell imported from North Africa. The question of how metallurgical knowledge reached Iberia from its centres of origin in the Near East and southeastern Europe has generated considerable scholarly discussion, with competing models emphasising different mechanisms of transmission. Some researchers have proposed that copper working technology spread westward across the Mediterranean through maritime connections, following coastal routes that would have allowed the movement of both objects and knowledge between communities engaged in seaborne exchange. The evidence for early navigation in the Mediterranean, while fragmentary, suggests that communities with access to maritime technology could have maintained connections spanning considerable distances, potentially allowing the diffusion of metallurgical knowledge without requiring continuous overland chains of transmission. Other scholars have emphasised the role of Central European exchange networks in transmitting copper working technology westward, proposing that the Iberian Chalcolithic represented the western terminus of routes that connected the peninsula to the Balkan and Carpathian regions, where smelting technology had achieved early development. The archaeological evidence remains compatible with multiple models of transmission, and the possibility that metallurgical knowledge reached Iberia through several different pathways cannot be excluded. The indigenous development of metallurgical traditions within Iberia, building upon transmitted knowledge but adapting it to local circumstances and resources, demonstrated the creative capacity of Chalcolithic communities to modify imported technology rather than simply replicating it. The copper ores of the Iberian Peninsula differed in composition from those available in other regions, and the smelting techniques required to extract metal from these ores necessarily evolved to accommodate their particular characteristics. The presence of arsenic in many Iberian copper ores created opportunities for producing arsenical bronze, a copper-arsenic alloy with superior hardness and casting properties compared to pure copper, and Iberian metalworkers appear to have recognized and exploited these properties during the Chalcolithic period, producing objects with arsenical bronze compositions that anticipated the tin-bronze technology that would characterize the subsequent Bronze Age. The development of lost wax casting techniques in Chalcolithic Iberia allowed the production of objects with complex shapes that could not be achieved through simple open mold casting, demonstrating the continued elaboration of metallurgical knowledge within regional traditions that were no longer dependent upon external sources for technological innovation. The social organization of Iberian Chalcolithic communities appears to have differed in significant ways from patterns observed in other regions of Chalcolithic development, with evidence suggesting relatively complex hierarchical structures that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of elite individuals or lineages. The fortified settlements that characterized the Iberian Chalcolithic, with their substantial defensive works and differentiated internal organization, implied social conditions that required or justified significant investment in collective security, while also creating physical expressions of community identity and boundaries. The collective burial practices that predominated during this period with multiple individuals interred together in constructed tombs over extended periods, suggested kinship-based social organisation in which group identity took precedence over individual distinction. Though the presence of differentiated grave goods within collective tombs indicated that status differences existed within the burial communities, the integration of metallurgical production within these social structures created new opportunities for the accumulation and display of wealth through the acquisition of copper and gold objects, while the specialised knowledge required for metal production may have conferred particular status upon those individuals or communities that controlled metallurgical activities. The spread of copper working technology to the British Isles proceeded along different pathways and according to different chronologies than the transmission to Iberia, reflecting the island's greater distance from continental sources of metallurgical innovation and the distinctive character of insular Neolithic societies. The communities that inhabited Britain and Ireland during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE had developed sophisticated traditions of monument construction, agricultural production, and long-distance exchange that demonstrated organisational capabilities comparable to those observed in any contemporary European context, but they accomplished these achievements entirely within a lithic technological framework that made no use of metal. The great henge monuments, including Stonehenge itself, whose earliest construction phases date to the late 4th millennium BCE, represented investments of labour and organisational capacity that rival or exceed any contemporary construction projects on the European continent, yet the tools used in their construction remained fashioned from stone, bone, and antler rather than from copper or bronze. The persistence of these monumentally inclined Neolithic traditions in Britain while copper working was spreading across continental Europe demonstrated that metallurgical technology was not a necessary prerequisite for complex social organisation or impressive material accomplishments. The eventual arrival of copper working in the British Isles, which most evidence places in the period around 2400 to 2200 BCE, coincided with other significant changes in insular material culture and population composition that have been associated with the spread of the beaker phenomenon across Western Europe. The distinctive bell beaker pottery that appeared in Britain during this period, accompanied by new burial practices emphasising individual rather than collective interment, and by a range of associated artefact types, including copper daggers and archery equipment, represented the material signature of cultural changes whose precise mechanisms remain debated. Genetic analysis of beaker period burials in Britain has revealed substantial population turnover, with the majority of later British populations descended primarily from incoming groups rather than from the indigenous Neolithic inhabitants, suggesting that the adoption of metallurgy in Britain was associated with significant demographic change rather than simply the transmission of technology to existing populations. The relationship between technological change and population movement that this evidence implies complicates simple models of diffusion, while raising questions about the social and demographic processes through which major technological transitions occurred during the Chalcolithic period. The copper resources of the British Isles, particularly those of Ireland and Wales, would eventually support substantial metallurgical industries during the Bronze Age proper, but the exploitation of these resources during the earliest phases of insular metalworking remains less clear. The earliest copper objects found in British contexts appear to include both locally produced items and imports from continental sources, suggesting that the establishment of local metallurgical production proceeded gradually rather than accompanying immediately the introduction of metal objects. The Irish copper deposits of Ross Island in County Kerry show evidence of early exploitation during the Chalcolithic period, with mining activities that extracted copper-bearing ores from shallow deposits using stone tools and fire-setting techniques that had been developed in continental contexts. The metal produced from Ross Island ores possess distinctive trace element signatures that allow archaeologists to identify objects made from Irish copper in both insular and continental contexts, demonstrating that Ireland rapidly transitioned from metal recipient to metal producer and exporter once local metallurgical traditions became established. The transformations that characterised the Chalcolithic period extended beyond the purely technological realm to encompass fundamental changes in how human communities organised themselves, related to one another, and conceptualised their place within the natural and supernatural worlds. The new possibilities that metal production created for the accumulation and display of wealth, combined with the specialised knowledge that metallurgical activities required, contributed to processes of social differentiation that distinguished the Chalcolithic from earlier periods, while anticipating patterns that would become more pronounced during the Bronze Age. The emergence of individuals or groups whose status derived at least in part from their control over metallurgical resources or expertise represented a departure from the more egalitarian social arrangements that appear to have characterized many Neolithic communities, though the extent and timing of these changes varied considerably across different regions of Chalcolithic development. The material expressions of status differentiation, including elaborate burial treatment, distinctive personal ornaments, and preferential access to valued objects, became increasingly visible in the archaeological record during the Chalcolithic period, providing evidence for social hierarchies whose development the new technology both enabled and expressed. The religious and symbolic dimensions of early metallurgy, while difficult to access through archaeological evidence alone, likely played significant roles in shaping how Chalcolithic communities understood and integrated the new technology. The transformation of dull stone into gleaming metal through the application of fire involved processes that appeared to transcend the ordinary operations of the natural world, suggesting connections to supernatural forces or specialized knowledge that set metalworkers apart from ordinary community members. The colors, sounds, and smells of metallurgical operations created distinctive sensory experiences that may have reinforced perceptions of metal production as an activity involving forces beyond normal human comprehension or control. The association of metal objects with elite burials and ritual deposits throughout the Chalcolithic world suggested that copper and the objects made from it carried symbolic significance beyond their practical utility, serving as markers of status, power, or connection to supernatural realms that enhanced the value they held within their communities. The environmental impacts of Chalcolithic metallurgical activities, while modest compared to those that would characterize later periods of industrial metal production, nevertheless represented the beginnings of human-induced environmental modification on scales that would eventually transform entire landscapes. The forests that provided the charcoal fuel essential for smelting operations experienced increased pressure as metallurgical activities expanded, creating localized zones of deforestation around established production centers. The accumulation of metallurgical waste products, including slag and other residues of smelting activities, created distinctive anthropogenic deposits that altered local soil chemistry and vegetation patterns, while providing modern archaeologists with evidence for the location and scale of ancient production activities. The mining operations that extracted copper-bearing ores from bedrock sources, while still relatively small in scale compared to later extraction activities, initiated processes of landscape modification that would accelerate dramatically during subsequent millennia as demand for metals increased and extraction technology improved. The chronological boundaries of the Chalcolithic period varied considerably across different regions, reflecting the asynchronous nature of metallurgical development and the local factors that influenced how communities adopted and integrated the new technology. In the Near East, where smelting technology first emerged, the Chalcolithic period conventionally encompasses the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, ending with the appearance of bronze technology and the intensification of social complexity that characterized the Uruk period and its contemporaries. In southeastern Europe, the Chalcolithic similarly spans the 5th and 4th millennia, terminating with the disruptions and population movements that appear to have affected the region around 4000 BCE, and the subsequent development of Bronze Age cultures drawing upon different demographic and cultural foundations. In Western and Northern Europe, the Chalcolithic arrives later, and in some cases merges almost imperceptibly into the early Bronze Age, creating terminological and chronological frameworks that differ substantially from those applied to the Near Eastern and Balkan regions. The variability of Chalcolithic chronologies across different regions reflects the broader reality that metallurgical technology spread through processes that varied in their mechanisms, timing, and social implications depending upon the specific circumstances prevailing in receiving communities. The relationship between the Chalcolithic period and the subsequent Bronze Age involved both continuities and discontinuities that complicate efforts to establish clear boundaries between the two phases. The fundamental technological innovation that distinguished the Bronze Age from the Chalcolithic was the development and widespread adoption of bronze itself, an alloy of copper with tin or occasionally arsenic that possessed hardness, durability, and casting properties superior to those of unalloyed copper. The discovery that adding tin to molten copper produced an alloy with substantially improved characteristics, represented a conceptual breakthrough, comparable in its implications to the original development of smelting, requiring understanding that the properties of metals could be deliberately modified through the addition of other substances. The social and economic implications of bronze production proved equally significant, since tin deposits occurred in geographical distributions quite different from those of copper ores, necessitating long-distance exchange networks to bring together the raw materials required for bronze production. The tin sources that would supply Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near Eastern metallurgy included deposits in regions as distant as Cornwall, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, creating networks of exchange that connected communities separated by thousands of kilometers and establishing patterns of interregional interaction that would characterize the Bronze Age world. The transition from Chalcolithic copperworking to Bronze Age tin-bronze metallurgy proceeded gradually rather than abruptly, with arsenical bronzes providing intermediate stages in some regions, while experimental alloying with various substances occurred in others. The communities that had developed sophisticated copperworking traditions during the Chalcolithic period provided the technological and organizational foundations upon which Bronze Age metallurgy would build, transmitting knowledge of pyrotechnical processes, casting techniques, and/or processing methods to subsequent generations while adapting these capabilities to work with the new alloy materials. The continuity of metallurgical knowledge across the Chalcolithic Bronze Age boundary ensured that the innovations of the Bronze Age built upon rather than replaced the achievements of the preceding period, creating developmental trajectories that connected the earliest experiments with native copper in the 7th and 6th millennia BCE to the sophisticated metallurgical industries of later periods. The geographical distribution of early copper working centres across the Near East and Southeastern Europe created distinct regional traditions that, while sharing fundamental technological principles, developed characteristic approaches to ore selection, smelting practice, and artifact production that reflected local circumstances and cultural preferences. The communities inhabiting the Iranian plateau during the 5th millennium BCE participated in metallurgical developments that paralleled and in some respects rivaled those occurring in Anatolia and the Levant, drawing upon the copper ore deposits scattered across the highland regions, stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the deserts of eastern Iran. The site of Tali Iblis in southeastern Iran provided particularly significant evidence for early smelting activities, with excavations revealing workshop areas containing slag accumulations, furnace fragments, and copper artifacts dating to the 5th millennium BCE that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of high-temperature reduction processes. The metallurgists working at Tali Iblis and similar Iranian sites developed techniques adapted to the specific characteristics of local ore deposits, which in many cases contained arsenic as a natural impurity that affected the properties of the resulting metal without requiring deliberate alloying practices. The arsenical copper produced from these Iranian ores possessed hardness and casting properties intermediate between pure copper and true bronze, providing functional advantages that may have contributed to the adoption of copper. Working in communities that encountered this naturally enhanced material, the relationship between Iranian metallurgical traditions and those developing simultaneously in Anatolia and Mesopotamia involved complex patterns of interaction and independent innovation that continue to generate scholarly debate regarding the mechanisms through which knowledge and technology spread across these interconnected regions. The communities of the Iranian plateau during the Chalcolithic period inhabited landscapes characterized by extreme environmental contrasts, with highland valleys receiving sufficient precipitation for agriculture, existing in close proximity to desert basins, where human occupation concentrated around oasis locations and seasonal water sources. The copper ore deposits that attracted metallurgical activities occurred predominantly in the highland zones, where geological processes had concentrated mineralization in formations accessible to ancient mining techniques, while providing fuel sources in the form of highland forests that supplied the substantial charcoal requirements of smelting operations. The organization of copper production in these Iranian contexts appears to have involved seasonal or intermittent activities conducted by communities whose primary economic activities centered upon agricultural and pastoral pursuits, with metallurgical work representing a specialized supplement to broader subsistence strategies rather than a full-time occupational specialization. The artifacts produced by Iranian copper workers during the 5th millennium BCE included tools, ornaments, and ritual objects that circulated through exchange networks connecting highland production centres with the lowland agricultural communities, establishing patterns of regional economic integration that would expand dramatically during subsequent millennia. The aesthetic preferences evident in Iranian copper artefacts of this period reflected broader regional artistic traditions while incorporating distinctive elements that marked products of specific workshops or communities, creating material signatures that modern archaeology can sometimes identify across considerable distances from their places of production. The Tel Halaf culture that flourished across northern Mesopotamia and the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates drainages during the 6th and 5th millennia BCE participated in metallurgical developments that connected Anatolian traditions with emerging centres of copper working in the Syrian and Iraqi regions. The communities associated with Tel Halaf material culture occupied a geographical zone that included access to copper ore deposits in the Taurus foothills, while maintaining connections with agricultural populations in the Mesopotamian lowlands, whose productive economies generated surplus resources capable of supporting craft specialization. The distinctive painted pottery that characterizes Tel Halaf assemblages, with its elaborate geometric and naturalistic designs executed in polychrome schemes of unprecedented sophistication, demonstrates the artistic capabilities and aesthetic sensibilities of communities that were simultaneously developing proficiency in metallurgical production. The relationship between ceramic excellence and metallurgical innovation in Tel Halaf contexts reflected broader connections between pyrotechnical knowledge and cultural achievement, with communities that had mastered the complex temperature control and material manipulation required for fine pottery production, applying similar understanding to the equally demanding processes of copper smelting and casting. The settlement patterns characteristic of Tel Halaf communities included both large agricultural villages and smaller specialized sites whose functions may have included seasonal exploitation of mineral resources, suggesting organizational flexibility that allowed communities to pursue diverse economic activities across the varied landscapes they inhabited. The material culture associated with Tel Halaf sites demonstrates the integration of copper artifacts into ritual and social practices that distinguish this cultural tradition from its predecessors and contemporaries. The elaborate burial practices documented at Tel Halaf sites included the deposition of copper objects alongside ceramic vessels, stone tools, and personal ornaments, indicating that metal artifacts had acquired symbolic significance within systems of status differentiation and mortuary commemoration. The stylistic unity evident across Tel Halaf material culture, extending over considerable geographical distances from southeastern Turkey through northern Syria and into northern Iraq, suggests networks of communication and interaction that facilitated the spread of both artistic conventions and technical knowledge across communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. The mechanisms through which Tel Halaf cultural traits and associated technologies spread across this extensive region remain subjects of ongoing investigation, with hypotheses ranging from population movement and colonization to the spread of shared ideologies and practices through exchange relationships among established communities. The decline of Tel Halaf cultural patterns during the mid-5th millennium BCE and the subsequent emergence of Ubaid-related material culture across much of the same geographical region represented a significant cultural transition whose implications for metallurgical traditions and practices remain incompletely understood. The Ubaid culture that expanded northward from its southern Mesopotamian heartland during the 5th millennium BCE brought distinctive material culture traditions into regions previously associated with Tel Halaf and other northern ceramic traditions while participating in metallurgical developments that continued trajectories established during earlier periods. The communities associated with Ubaid material culture inhabited the alluvial landscapes of southern Mesopotamia, where the absence of local stone and metal resources necessitated the development of long-distance exchange networks to acquire materials unavailable in the riverine environment. The expansion of Ubaid-related material culture into highland regions with access to copper ore deposits facilitated the integration of metallurgical production into exchange systems centered upon southern Mesopotamian communities, creating economic relationships that foreshadowed the more elaborate trade networks of subsequent Uruk period commercial activities. The painted pottery traditions that characterize Ubaid assemblages, while differing stylistically from Tel Halaf ceramics, demonstrate comparable technical sophistication in ceramic production that reflected the same kind of pyrotechnical expertise applicable to metallurgical processes. The relationship between Ubaid expansion and the organization of copper production and distribution remains a subject of ongoing archaeological investigation, with evidence suggesting that southern Mesopotamian communities increasingly participated in exchange relationships that brought metal artifacts and raw materials southward, while transmitting elements of Ubaid material culture into regions possessing the mineral resources absent from the alluvial lowlands. The settlement patterns characteristic of Ubaid communities in southern Mesopotamia demonstrated organizational principles that would prove significant for the subsequent development of urban civilization in the region. The emergence of larger settlements with evidence for public architecture, specialized craft production areas, and social differentiation during the Ubaid period established precedents that would culminate in the urban centers of the 4th millennium BCE and their associated political and economic institutions. The role of copper and other exotic materials in the social dynamics of Ubaid communities contributed to patterns of inequality and status differentiation that archaeological evidence reveals through differential access to metal artifacts and other prestige goods in burial contexts. The administrative technologies that would characterize later Mesopotamian civilization, including systems of accounting and record-keeping using tokens and early numerical notations, appear to have their origins in the organizational requirements of Ubaid period communities managing increasingly complex economic activities, including the acquisition and distribution of materials obtained through long-distance exchange. The relationship between metallurgical development and administrative innovation reflected broader connections between technological capability and social complexity that characterized the Chalcolithic period across multiple regions of the Near East. The Vinča culture of southeastern Europe represented a distinct trajectory of Chalcolithic development that paralleled Near Eastern traditions while developing characteristics reflecting the specific circumstances of Balkan communities during the 5th millennium BCE. The settlements associated with Vinča material culture, concentrated in the modern territories of Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and adjacent regions, achieved sizes and organizational complexity unprecedented in European prehistory, with some sites attaining populations and spatial extents comparable to early urban settlements in other world regions. The copper working traditions that developed within Vinča context drew upon the rich mineral resources of the Balkan region, where geological processes had concentrated copper ores in formations that attracted metallurgical activities from an early date in the development of extraction and processing technologies. The sophistication of Vinča metallurgy, evident in the technical quality of surviving artifacts and the scale of production activities documented archaeologically, demonstrated that European communities developed capabilities comparable to those of Near Eastern metallurgists, while operating within social and cultural contexts quite different from those prevailing in Mesopotamia or Anatolia. The mining complexes that supplied Vinča metallurgical activities included operations at sites such as Rudna Glava in eastern Serbia, where ancient workings penetrated substantial depths into copper-bearing rock formations while generating waste accumulations that testify to the scale and duration of extraction activities. The miners who worked at Rudna Glava and similar Balkan extraction sites employed techniques including fire setting, in which rock faces were heated and then rapidly cooled to induce cracking that facilitated ore removal, while developing shaft and gallery systems that followed ore bodies into the subsurface beyond the reach of simple pit mining. The labour investments required for deep mining operations of this character implied organisational capabilities that enabled communities to mobilise and coordinate significant workforces while managing the technical challenges of underground extraction, including ventilation, water control, and the prevention of collapse. The relationship between mining communities and the broader networks of Vinča settlement remains incompletely understood, with evidence suggesting both specialised mining communities occupying locations near ore deposits and seasonal or periodic mining activities conducted by communities whose primary settlements lay at some distance from mineral resources. The metallurgical products of Vinča culture included a distinctive repertoire of artifact types that reflected regional aesthetic preferences while demonstrating technical capabilities comparable to those of contemporary Near Eastern copper workers. The heavy copper tools produced by Vinča metallurgists, including shaft-hole axes of substantial size and weight, represented casting achievements that required both metallurgical expertise and the ability to produce clay moulds capable of withstanding the stresses of molten metal introduction. The ornamental objects characteristic of Vinča copper production, including pins, rings, bracelets, and decorative plaques, circulated through exchange networks that distributed products of specialized workshops across considerable portions of the Balkan region while transmitting stylistic conventions and technical knowledge among communities participating in these exchange relationships. The symbolic significance attached to copper artifacts in Vinča contexts appears in their inclusion in burial assemblages and their representation in the elaborate figurative traditions that constitute one of the most distinctive features of Vinča material culture. The anthropomorphic figurines produced in Vinča communities sometimes incorporate representations of metal ornaments, suggesting that copper objects had become sufficiently integrated into systems of personal adornment and social signification that their representation in other media conveyed meaningful information about status, identity, or supernatural associations. The social organization of Vinča communities during the height of their development demonstrated characteristics that some scholars have described as approaching urban complexity, with large settlements, specialized craft production, long-distance exchange connections, and evidence for social differentiation, suggesting organizational capabilities comparable to early complex societies in otherworld regions. The apparent absence of monumental architecture and concentrated political authority in Vinča contexts, however, distinguished these communities from the hierarchical polities developing contemporaneously in Mesopotamia, suggesting alternative pathways towards social complexity that did not necessarily involve the concentration of power in ruling institutions or individuals. The debate concerning the appropriate characterization of Vinča social organization reflects broader discussions within archaeology regarding the diversity of forms that early complex societies might assume, and the inadequacy of developmental models derived primarily from Near Eastern and other Old World urban traditions. The eventual decline of Vinča culture during the later 5th and early 4th millennia BCE involved processes that remain incompletely understood, but appear to have included significant demographic disruption and cultural transformation that affected metallurgical traditions alongside other aspects of Vinča material culture. The proto-urban centres that emerged in the Levantine region during the Chalcolithic period demonstrated developmental trajectories distinct from both Mesopotamian and Balkan patterns, while participating in metallurgical traditions that reflected the geographical position of the Levant between multiple centres of early copper working. The sites associated with the Gasulian culture of the southern Levant, dating to the later 5th and 4th millennia BCE, included settlements of substantial size whose material culture demonstrates connections with both Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions, while retaining distinctive regional characteristics. The metallurgical capabilities of Gasulian communities achieved remarkable expression in the copper artifacts recovered from the Nahal Mishmar hoard in the Judean desert, where over 400 copper objects including elaborate mace heads, standards, and ceremonial implements were discovered hidden in a cave overlooking the Dead Sea Basin. The technical sophistication of the Nahal Mishmar objects, produced using lost wax casting techniques that enabled the creation of complex three-dimensional forms impossible to achieve through simpler casting methods, demonstrated that Levantine metallurgists of the 4th millennium BCE possessed capabilities at the forefront of contemporary technological development anywhere in the ancient world. The relationship between the Nahal Mishmar hoard and the communities that produced and deposited these extraordinary objects remains a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation and interpretive debate. The ritual character of many objects in the assemblage, including items whose forms suggest ceremonial rather than practical functions, has led some scholars to associate the hoard with temple treasuries, or the paraphernalia of religious institutions whose practitioners concealed their valuables in response to some crisis or threat. The metallurgical analysis of Nahal Mishmar objects has revealed the use of arsenical copper, with composition characteristics suggesting ore sources in the Araba region or Sinai Peninsula, while the stylistic attributes of individual pieces demonstrate influences from multiple cultural traditions, including elements with apparent connections to Mesopotamian iconography. The organizational implications of producing an assemblage of this character, requiring access to substantial quantities of copper, mastery of advanced casting techniques, and the ability to support specialized craft workers capable of executing designs of considerable artistic ambition, suggest that Gasulian communities possessed institutional capabilities for coordinating complex productive activities and accumulating material wealth on scales previously unattested in the Levantine region. The communities inhabiting the Iberian Peninsula during the Chalcolithic period participated in metallurgical developments that arrived through mechanisms of cultural transmission operating across the Western Mediterranean and along Atlantic coastal routes connecting Iberia with more northerly European regions. The copper ore deposits of southern and western Iberia, concentrated particularly in the region modern archaeology identifies with the Los Millares culture and the subsequent Beaker phenomenon, attracted metallurgical activities that developed regional traditions while maintaining connections with broader European networks of knowledge and material exchange. The Los Millares site itself, located in southeastern Spain, in the modern province of Almería, represents one of the most extensively investigated Chalcolithic settlements in Western Europe, with its defensive walls, elaborate burial monuments, and evidence for copper production, providing detailed information about the organisation and capabilities of Iberian communities during the 3rd millennium BCE. The copper artefacts produced at Los Millares and related sites included tools, weapons, and ornaments whose typological characteristics demonstrate connections with broader European traditions while incorporating distinctive regional elements that marked products of Iberian workshops. The megalithic burial monuments that characterise Iberian Chalcolithic cultures provided context for the deposition of copper artefacts alongside ceramic vessels, stone tools, and other grave goods that illuminate the social significance attached to metal objects within these communities. The collective burial practices associated with megalithic monuments, involving the successive interment of multiple individuals within single, architectural structures over extended periods, created assemblages that accumulated through repeated depositional episodes while reflecting evolving attitudes toward death, ancestry, and the commemoration of the dead across generations of community members. The inclusion of copper artifacts in these burial contexts demonstrates that metal objects had acquired roles within mortuary practices that assigned them significance beyond their purely functional utility, suggesting symbolic associations with status, power, or supernatural forces that made them appropriate companions for the journey of the dead into whatever afterlife these communities envisioned. The distribution of copper artifacts across burials within single monuments and across monuments within regional settlement systems has enabled archaeologists to investigate patterns of differential access to metal goods that illuminate aspects of Chalcolithic social organisation not directly visible in the archaeological record of domestic settlements. The metallurgical traditions that developed in the British Isles during the late 4th and 3rd millennia BCE arrived through networks of contact and exchange connecting Atlantic coastal communities across considerable maritime distances. The copper ore deposits of Ireland, Wales, and southwestern England would become significant sources of metal during the Bronze Age, but the earliest evidence for metallurgical activities in these islands reflects the adoption of technologies developed elsewhere rather than independent local innovation. The mechanisms through which metallurgical knowledge reached British and Irish communities remain subjects of ongoing investigation, with evidence suggesting that the arrival of copperworking coincided with broader cultural transformations associated with the spread of beaker material culture across Western and Northern Europe during the late 3rd millennium BCE. The copper artifacts that appear in British and Irish contexts during this transitional period include types with clear continental parallels alongside forms that may represent local adaptations of introduced traditions, suggesting creative engagement with imported technologies rather than simple imitation of foreign models. The figure known to modern audiences as Ötzi the Iceman, whose naturally mummified remains emerged from retreating glacial ice in the Ötztal Alps on the Austrian-Italian border in 1991, provided unprecedented direct evidence for Chalcolithic material culture and technology through the preservation of his body alongside the equipment he carried at the time of his death, approximately 53 centuries ago. The copper axe that formed part of Ötzi's equipment represented a tool of considerable value and sophistication, its blade cast from high-purity copper using techniques that demonstrated the metallurgical capabilities of alpine communities during the late 4th millennium BCE. The hafting arrangements that attached the copper blade to its wooden handle, preserved through the same glacial conditions that protected the organic remains of Ötzi himself, provided information about mounting techniques and tool construction previously unavailable from archaeological contexts where organic materials had decayed beyond recovery. The social implications of Ötzi's possession of such an axe have generated considerable scholarly discussion, with some investigators suggesting that access to copper tools of this quality indicated elevated social status, while others have proposed that copper implements may have been more widely distributed among Chalcolithic populations than their relative rarity in the archaeological record might suggest. The broader assemblage of equipment recovered with Ötzi's remains illuminated the material culture and technological capabilities of Chalcolithic alpine communities with a comprehensiveness impossible to achieve through conventional archaeological investigation of settlement sites and burial contexts. The bow, arrows, and other hunting equipment carried by Ötzi demonstrated the continuation of lithic and organic technologies alongside the newer metalworking traditions, confirming that Chalcolithic communities employed composite technological repertoires that drew upon both traditional and innovative materials and techniques according to the functional requirements of specific applications. The clothing and personal items preserved with the body revealed sophisticated working of leather, plant fibers, and other organic materials that complemented the metallurgical capabilities evident in the copper axe, suggesting communities possessed of diverse craft skills capable of producing the full range of equipment necessary for life in demanding mountain environments. The pathological and isotopic analysis of Ötzi's remains has provided information about his diet, health, injuries, and movements during the final years and days of his life, creating a biographical portrait of an individual Chalcolithic person unprecedented in its detail and immediacy, while raising interpretive questions about the circumstances that led to his death and abandonment at high altitude. The forensic investigation of Ötzi's final hours revealed evidence of violent conflict that preceded his death, including a defensive wound on his right hand consistent with close-quarters combat and, most significantly, an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder that had severed a major artery and would have caused rapid incapacitation and death within minutes of the wound being inflicted. The trajectory of the arrow indicated that Ötzi had been shot from behind and below, suggesting an attack by pursuers who had tracked him into the high alpine terrain where his body would remain preserved for more than 5 millennia. The violence that ended Ötzi's life illuminated aspects of Chalcolithic social relations that the material evidence of settlements and craft production could only hint at, demonstrating that the communities of this period experienced interpersonal and potentially intergroup conflict of sufficient intensity to result in lethal violence, and that individuals possessing valuable equipment including copper axes were not immune to such dangers. The circumstances that placed Ötzi in the high mountains at the time of his death, whether he was fleeing from enemies, travelling between communities, or engaged in seasonal activities such as hunting or pastoral transhumance, cannot be determined with certainty from the available evidence, though the combination of his equipment, his movements as reconstructed from isotopic analysis, and the violence that killed him suggests a complex individual history that defies simple characterization. The copper that formed the blade of Ötzi's axe originated from ore deposits in Tuscany, as demonstrated through trace element and lead isotope analysis that compared the metal's chemical signature with geological sources across the broader Alpine and Mediterranean regions. The identification of a Tuscan origin for the copper indicated that Ötzi or his community maintained connections with exchange networks extending several hundred kilometers to the south, either through direct long-distance travel or through intermediary relationships that facilitated the movement of metal and other materials across considerable distances. The evidence for such extensive exchange networks during the Chalcolithic period confirms that metallurgical innovations spread not in isolation, but as components of broader systems of interaction that connected communities across diverse environmental zones and cultural traditions. The Alpine communities among whom Ötzi lived occupied a geographic position that provided potential access to exchange routes connecting Mediterranean coastal regions with the continental interior of Central Europe, and the copper axe he carried may represent material evidence of participation in such transalpine exchange systems. The technological analysis of Ötzi's axe blade revealed manufacturing techniques that demonstrated considerable metallurgical sophistication, including evidence for casting in a bivalve mould followed by extensive cold working to shape and harden the cutting edge. The purity of the copper, containing only trace amounts of arsenic and other elements that would have been present in arsenical copper alloys, indicated that the metalworkers who produced the blade either had access to exceptionally pure ore sources or had developed purification techniques capable of removing unwanted impurities during the smelting process. The casting and finishing techniques evident in the axe blade represented accumulated knowledge developed through generations of metallurgical experimentation and practice, transmitted through apprenticeship and demonstration in ways that created distinct regional traditions recognizable through stylistic and technical analysis of surviving artifacts. The hafting arrangement that attached the blade to its handle employed binding materials and techniques that maximized the functional efficiency of the tool while allowing for resharpening and eventual replacement of the blade without requiring construction of an entirely new implement, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of tool design and maintenance requirements. The broader pattern of copper metallurgy across the Alpine region during the period of Ötzi's lifetime reflected the expansion of metalworking traditions that had developed in southeastern Europe and the Carpathian Basin during the preceding centuries, modified and adapted to local conditions and resources as they spread westward and northward into new territories. The copper ore deposits of the Eastern Alps, particularly those in the Salzburg region and the Trentino Alto Adige area, would become major sources of metal during the subsequent Bronze Age. Though evidence for their exploitation during the Chalcolithic period remains limited, and the metal in Ötzi's axe derived from Italian rather than Alpine sources, the development of Alpine metallurgy represented one of several parallel processes through which copper working traditions established in southeastern European core areas diffused into adjacent regions, each regional tradition developing distinctive characteristics while maintaining connections with the broader networks of exchange and interaction that characterized Chalcolithic Europe. The spread of metallurgical knowledge into the Iberian Peninsula during the late 4th and 3rd millennia BCE demonstrated another trajectory of diffusion and local adaptation that transformed societies across southwestern Europe while establishing the foundations for the distinctive Bronze Age cultures that would emerge in this region during subsequent centuries. The copper ore deposits of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly those concentrated in the Rio Tinto region of southwestern Spain and the Serra de Cavaller in southeastern Spain, represented some of the richest copper sources in the Mediterranean world, and would eventually support intensive metal production that supplied extensive exchange networks extending throughout the western Mediterranean and Atlantic coastal regions. The earliest evidence for metallurgical activities in Iberia appears during the late 4th millennium BCE, somewhat later than the initial development of copper working in southeastern Europe, but considerably earlier than the establishment of metallurgy in the British Isles and other peripheral regions of Western Europe. The cultural contexts within which Iberian metallurgy developed differed significantly from those of southeastern Europe, reflecting local traditions and social arrangements that shaped the adoption and integration of metalworking technologies in distinctive ways. The late Neolithic and Chalcolithic societies of Iberia had developed complex patterns of settlement, subsistence, and social organization that provided frameworks within which metallurgical innovations were incorporated without necessarily disrupting existing arrangements. The megalithic burial traditions that characterized Atlantic and Mediterranean Iberia during this period continued alongside the adoption of copper working, with metal artifacts appearing in burial contexts that maintained continuity with earlier monumental traditions, while incorporating new categories of goods that reflected access to metallurgical products. The relationship between metallurgical development and the construction of fortified settlements in southeastern Iberia during the 3rd millennium BCE has generated considerable scholarly attention, with debates focusing on whether the emergence of defensive architecture reflected increasing competition for access to metal resources or broader social transformations that coincidentally accompanied the expansion of copper working. The site of Los Millares in the province of Almeria in southeastern Spain has provided extensive evidence for Chalcolithic settlement patterns, burial practices, and metallurgical activities that illuminate the complex societies that developed in this region during the 3rd millennium BCE. The main settlement at Los Millares occupied a promontory position, defended by multiple lines of stone walls and bastions, representing one of the most substantial architectural undertakings of the Iberian Chalcolithic, and suggesting social organisation capable of mobilising considerable labour for communal construction projects. The cemetery associated with the settlement contained approximately 100 passage graves, collective burial monuments that housed the remains of multiple individuals deposited over extended periods of use and containing grave goods that included copper artefacts, alongside traditional categories of stone, bone, and ceramic objects. The metallurgical evidence from Los Millares and related sites in southeastern Iberia indicates that local communities were producing copper through smelting processes that employed local ore sources, though the scale and organisation of this production remain subjects of ongoing investigation. The Vila Nova de São Pedro culture of central Portugal and the contemporaneous developments in southern Portuguese regions demonstrated parallel but distinct trajectories of Chalcolithic social and technological development that reflected local conditions and traditions. The fortified settlement of Vila Nova de São Pedro itself, along with related sites such as Zambural and others distributed across the Portuguese Extremadura region, showed defensive architectural elaboration comparable to that evident at Los Milares, suggesting broadly similar concerns with settlement defence and social organisation across different regions of the Iberian Chalcolithic. The copper artefacts recovered from these Portuguese sites reflected access to metallurgical products through production, exchange, or both, though the evidence for local smelting activities remains less extensive than that available from southeastern Spanish contexts. The distinctive ceramic forms and decorative traditions of the Vila Nova de São Pedro culture, including characteristic vessels with thickened rims and incised or impressed decoration, provided chronological and cultural markers that allow archaeologists to trace connections and distinctions among contemporary Chalcolithic communities across the Iberian Peninsula. The beaker phenomenon, which spread across much of Western and Central Europe during the late 3rd millennium BCE, introduced new patterns of material culture and burial practice that coincided with, and in some regions accompanied, the expansion of metallurgical activities into previously non-metallurgical areas. The distinctive bell beaker pottery, characterized by its inverted bell-shaped profile and zones of impressed or incised decoration, appeared in contexts from the Atlantic coast to Central Europe and the Mediterranean, raising questions about the mechanisms of its spread that have generated decades of scholarly debate. The association between beaker material culture and early copper metallurgy in regions such as the British Isles and Northern Europe suggested possible connections between the spread of this distinctive pottery tradition and the diffusion of metalworking knowledge, though the precise nature of these relationships varied considerably across different regional contexts. The beaker package of material culture typically included not only the characteristic pottery, but also distinctive personal ornaments, archery equipment, and copper daggers or other metal items, suggesting that beaker practices involved not merely the adoption of a pottery style, but participation in broader patterns of material culture and possibly social organisation. The arrival of metallurgical knowledge in the British Isles during the late 3rd millennium BCE transformed the technological repertoires of communities that had previously relied entirely upon stone, bone, wood, and other organic materials for the production of tools and weapons. The earliest copper artefacts in Britain and Ireland reflected close connections with continental beaker traditions, including dagger and axe forms with clear parallels in Central and Western European contexts. The development of distinctive insular forms alongside these imported types during the subsequent Early Bronze Age demonstrated the creative engagement with metallurgical traditions that characterized the adoption of new technologies as island communities modified continental models to suit local preferences and requirements. The copper ore deposits that would support the extensive metal production of the British and Irish Bronze Age, particularly the deposits at Great Orme in Wales, Ross Island in southwestern Ireland, and various locations in southwestern England, began to be exploited during this transitional period, though the scale of early production remained modest compared to the intensive mining activities that would characterize later centuries. The social transformations that accompanied the arrival of metallurgy in the British Isles cannot be separated from the broader changes associated with the beaker phenomenon, including shifts in burial practices from collective interment in megalithic monuments toward individual burial in flat graves or small mounds. The appearance of individual burials accompanied by distinctive assemblages of personal items, including copper daggers, archery equipment, and beaker pottery, suggested new emphases on individual identity and status that contrasted with the collective orientations evident in earlier Neolithic burial traditions. The interpretation of these changes has generated considerable scholarly debate, with some investigators emphasizing population movement from the continent as the primary mechanism of cultural transformation, while others have stressed local adoption and adaptation of introduced practices by indigenous communities. The genetic evidence from British beaker burials, which has become available through recent advances in ancient DNA analysis, indicates substantial population replacement during this period, suggesting that the cultural transformations evident in the archaeological record reflected actual migration rather than purely cultural diffusion. The metallurgical and social developments of the Chalcolithic period established foundations that would be built upon and transformed during the subsequent Bronze Age, as the addition of tin to copper produced alloys with superior working properties that enabled new applications and encouraged the expansion of metal production and exchange. The transition from copper to bronze occurred at different times in different regions, reflecting the variable availability of tin ores and the diverse trajectories through which metallurgical knowledge and practice spread across prehistoric Europe and the Near East. The communities of the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE who first mastered copper smelting and casting could not have anticipated the transformations that their innovations would enable, yet the skills and social arrangements they developed provided essential prerequisites for the subsequent elaboration of metallurgical traditions during the Bronze Age and beyond. The legacy of Chalcolithic metallurgy extended beyond the specific techniques and artifacts that characterized this period to encompass broader transformations in how human communities organized production, exchange, and social relations. The specialist knowledge required for successful metalworking created categories of skilled practitioners whose expertise occupied positions of value within their communities, contributing to patterns of craft specialization and occupational differentiation that would intensify during subsequent periods. The exchange networks through which metal and metallurgical knowledge circulated connected communities across considerable distances, creating relationships that transcended local boundaries and enabled the spread of ideas, practices, and materials far beyond their regions of origin. The social value attached to metal objects, whether as tools, weapons, ornaments, or symbols of status and achievement, introduced new dimensions into the material negotiations of social relationships, providing novel media through which individuals and groups could express and contest their positions within evolving social hierarchies. The environmental impacts of Chalcolithic metallurgical activities, while modest compared to those that would accompany the more intensive production of later periods, nonetheless represented early instances of industrial transformation of landscapes through mining, fuel procurement, and smelting activities. The excavation of ore deposits created surface disturbances that altered local topography while generating waste materials that accumulated in the vicinity of extraction sites. The procurement of fuel for smelting operations, whether through collection of deadwood or deliberate felling of trees, contributed to deforestation in areas where metal production occurred, with potential consequences for local ecosystems, hydrology, and the availability of wood for other purposes. The pollution generated by smelting activities, including heavy metal residues and atmospheric emissions, left traces that remain detectable in environmental archives such as lake sediments and peat deposits, providing independent evidence for the timing and intensity of prehistoric metallurgical activities, alongside the archaeological record of artifacts and production debris. The chronological boundary between the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods represents a conceptual division imposed by modern scholarship, rather than a sharp break recognized by the communities who lived through this transition, and the precise dating of this boundary varies considerably across different regional traditions and scholarly frameworks. The technological criterion that nominally distinguishes these periods involves the systematic addition of tin to copper to produce bronze, an alloy with superior hardness and casting properties that enabled applications impossible with pure copper. The transition to tin bronze occurred gradually and unevenly, with some regions adopting the new alloy relatively early while others continued to employ copper or arsenical copper for extended periods after bronze had become established elsewhere. The social, economic, and cultural changes that accompanied the spread of bronze metallurgy built upon foundations established during the Chalcolithic period, representing intensifications and elaborations of trends already evident rather than revolutionary breaks with previous patterns. The period of transition from predominantly stone-based technologies to metal-using societies encompassed several centuries of gradual change, during which new materials and techniques were incorporated into existing cultural repertoires without immediately displacing established practices. The communities of the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age employed hybrid technological systems that combined traditional and innovative elements according to contextual requirements, selecting materials and techniques appropriate to specific applications rather than abandoning older approaches entirely upon the arrival of new alternatives. The coexistence of stone and metal technologies during this extended transitional period reflected pragmatic responses to the properties and availability of different materials, with stone tools continuing to serve efficiently for many everyday tasks, while metal items assumed particular importance in contexts where their distinctive properties conferred significant advantages or where their social value made them appropriate markers of status and occasion. The gradual character of technological change during this period demonstrated that innovation proceeded through accumulation and integration rather than through sudden transformations, as communities selectively adopted new practices while maintaining continuity with established traditions that continued to meet practical and social needs effectively. The Western Mediterranean basin during the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era presented conditions remarkably conducive to the expansion of copper metallurgy from its eastern origins toward the Atlantic peripheries of the European continent, with the Iberian Peninsula emerging as a particularly significant centre of indigenous metallurgical development that would eventually rival the sophistication of contemporary Near Eastern traditions. The geological endowment of the Iberian landmass included some of the richest copper ore deposits in the ancient world, concentrated particularly in the region that modern geographers designate as the Iberian Pyrite Belt, a geological formation stretching across southwestern Spain and southern Portugal that contained massive sulfide deposits, alongside substantial quantities of native copper and oxidized copper ores accessible to prehistoric prospectors. The communities inhabiting these mineral-rich landscapes during the Middle and Late Chalcolithic periods developed distinctive metallurgical traditions that combined influences from earlier Eastern Mediterranean practices with local innovations adapted to the particular characteristics of Iberian ore deposits and cultural contexts. The chronology of copper working in the Iberian Peninsula extended back to the late 5th millennium before the Common Era, when small copper artifacts began appearing in archaeological contexts associated with communities practicing mixed agricultural and pastoral economies, in regions where surface exposures of native copper or easily reduced oxide ores provided accessible raw materials for early experimental metalworking. The initial phase of Iberian metallurgy, documented at sites throughout the southern and central portions of the peninsula, involved relatively simple techniques of cold hammering and limited heating comparable to those practiced several centuries earlier in Anatolia and the Iranian highlands, suggesting either independent discovery of these elementary processes or transmission of basic metallurgical knowledge through the maritime networks connecting the eastern and western Mediterranean basins. The emergence of more sophisticated smelting technologies in the Iberian Peninsula during the 4th millennium before the Common Era coincided with broader transformations in settlement patterns, social organization, and material culture that archaeologists associate with the Chalcolithic cultures of this region, known variously through their characteristic material expressions, including the Vila Nova de São Pedro culture in Portugal and the Los Millares culture in southeastern Spain. The settlement of Los Millares itself, located in the province of Almería in what is now southeastern Spain, represented one of the most elaborate proto-urban developments in Chalcolithic Western Europe, featuring extensive stone fortification walls with projecting bastions, a central citadel area, and an associated cemetery containing collective tombs that housed the remains of hundreds of individuals accompanied by grave goods, including copper artifacts, fine ceramics, and exotic materials obtained through long-distance exchange. The metallurgical activities documented at Los Millares and contemporaneous settlements throughout southeastern Spain demonstrated mastery of smelting techniques capable of extracting copper from sulfide ores, which required more complex procedures than the reduction of oxide minerals that had characterized earlier metallurgical traditions. The development of sulfide smelting represented a significant technological achievement that substantially expanded the range of ore deposits exploitable by prehistoric metalworkers, opening access to deeper and more extensive mineral formations that would support increasingly intensive production during subsequent periods. The archaeological evidence from Los Millares and related sites included not only finished copper artifacts, but also production debris such as slag fragments, crucible fragments bearing copper residues, and tuyere pieces indicating the use of forced draft furnace systems comparable to those employed in contemporary Near Eastern metallurgical operations. The social organization of metallurgical production within Iberian Chalcolithic communities appears to have involved specialized practitioners whose activities were integrated into broader economic and ceremonial systems, rather than constituting entirely separate occupational categories divorced from other productive activities. The spatial distribution of metallurgical debris within excavated settlements suggested that metal production occurred in designated areas that may have been controlled by particular household groups or corporate entities within the community, though the evidence remained insufficient to determine whether metalworkers constituted a distinct social stratum or whether metallurgical skills were embedded within more comprehensive repertoires of craft knowledge possessed by individuals who also participated in other productive activities. The copper artifacts produced by Iberian Chalcolithic metalworkers included functional categories such as flat axes, awls, and chisels that served practical purposes in woodworking, leatherworking, and other craft activities, alongside ornamental and ceremonial objects, whose elaborate forms and contexts of deposition indicated roles in the expression of social distinctions and ritual observances. The presence of arsenical copper among the products of Iberian metallurgical traditions during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era demonstrated awareness of the beneficial effects of arsenic on copper alloys, whether this awareness derived from deliberate selection of arseniferous ores or from empirical recognition that certain ore sources yielded superior metal without necessarily understanding the chemical basis for this improvement. The mortuary evidence from Iberian Chalcolithic sites provided particularly important insights into the social valuation of copper and its integration into ceremonial practices surrounding death and commemoration. The collective tombs characteristic of Los Millares culture and related traditions contained grave assemblages in which copper objects appeared alongside other categories of prestige goods, including items manufactured from exotic materials that demonstrated access to long-distance exchange networks extending throughout the Western Mediterranean and beyond. The distribution of copper artifacts within these mortuary contexts revealed patterns suggesting that metal objects served as markers of social distinctions, though the collective nature of the burials complicated efforts to associate specific items with particular individuals and thereby trace the social identities of those who possessed or were commemorated with metal goods. The schematic engraved plaques that accompanied many burials in Portuguese Chalcolithic tombs depicted stylized human figures, some apparently wearing elaborate regalia that may have included metal ornaments, providing indirect evidence for the ceremonial display of metal objects by living individuals whose social positions warranted visual representation through these distinctive mortuary markers. The amber beads and other exotic materials that appeared alongside copper objects in Iberian Chalcolithic burials demonstrated connections to exchange networks extending northward toward the Baltic region and eastward toward the central Mediterranean, indicating that the communities of the Iberian Peninsula participated in communication systems of continental scale during this period. The fortified settlements that characterize the Iberian Chalcolithic, of which Los Millares represented the most elaborate example, but which extended throughout southeastern Spain and southern Portugal in various scales and configurations, reflected social conditions in which the defense of accumulated resources, including metal objects and metallurgical knowledge, constituted a significant concern for community organization. The investment of substantial labor in the construction of stone walls, bastions, and other defensive features indicated that these communities possessed organizational capacities sufficient to mobilize workforces for projects extending beyond immediate subsistence requirements, while the apparent need for such defenses suggested that competition and conflict over resources represented recurrent features of the social landscape. The role of metal objects within these competitive dynamics remained subject to scholarly interpretation, though the concentration of metallurgical production within fortified settlements and the presence of copper objects among the prestige goods accumulated by these communities suggested that control over metal resources and metalworking expertise may have contributed to the social differentiation evident in the archaeological record. The emergence of increasingly complex social hierarchies during the Iberian Chalcolithic period coincided with the intensification of metallurgical production in ways that suggested interconnections between these phenomena, though the precise causal relationships remain difficult to disentangle, given the multifactorial nature of social change and the limitations of archaeological evidence for reconstructing the motivations and calculations of prehistoric actors. The expansion of copper metallurgy beyond the Iberian Peninsula into other regions of Atlantic Europe during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era brought metalworking traditions into contact with communities whose cultural configurations differed substantially from those that had characterized the Mediterranean zones where metallurgy had first developed. the British Isles, separated from the European mainland by the English Channel and Irish Sea, but connected to continental communication networks through maritime contacts that had facilitated the transmission of agricultural practices, monumental building traditions, and other cultural innovations during preceding millennia, received copper metallurgy during the period around 2400 to 2200 before the Common Era, a chronological horizon associated with significant cultural changes, including the appearance of beaker pottery and related material assemblages that transformed the archaeological character of insular communities. The geological resources of the British Isles included substantial copper ore deposits in regions such as Wales, Ireland, and southwestern England, where subsequent prehistoric and historic periods would witness intensive exploitation of mineral resources that ranked among the most significant in northwestern Europe. The earliest copper artefacts recovered from British archaeological contexts demonstrated metallurgical characteristics suggesting both importation of finished objects from continental sources and local production, using techniques transmitted from established metallurgical regions, indicating a mixed pattern of technological adoption that combined acquisition of exotic products with development of indigenous manufacturing capabilities. The figure of Ötzi the Iceman, whose naturally mummified remains emerged from melting glacial ice in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between modern Austria and Italy in 1991, provided an unprecedented window into the material culture and technological capabilities of an individual who lived during the critical period of copper metallurgical expansion in temperate Europe during the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The radiocarbon dating of Ötzi's remains and associated organic materials established a date of death around 3300 before the Common Era, placing him chronologically within the European Chalcolithic period and geographically within the Alpine region, where communities had developed distinctive adaptations to montane environments while maintaining connections to lowland societies through exchange networks and seasonal transhumance patterns. The equipment recovered with Ötzi's body included an assemblage of tools and weapons that illustrated the technological repertoire available to an individual of apparently middling social status during this period, combining traditional stone and organic materials with metal objects whose presence demonstrated the penetration of metallurgical products into everyday material culture by this date. The most significant metal artifact among Ötzi's possessions was a copper axe, whose form and manufacturing technique provided crucial information about the state of Alpine metallurgical technology during the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The copper axe recovered alongside Ötzi's remains consisted of a relatively pure copper blade, containing only trace quantities of arsenic and other elements, hafted onto a yew-wood handle through a precisely fitted wooden knee joint that secured the metal blade in functional position for use in woodworking, land clearance, and potentially defensive applications. The metallurgical analysis of the axe blade revealed that it had been manufactured through casting in a mould, followed by extensive working through hammering and annealing cycles that refined its shape and work, hardened its cutting edge to improve functional performance. The casting technique employed for this artifact demonstrated competence in creating molten copper of sufficient temperature and fluidity to fill a mould cavity and solidify into a coherent mass, while the subsequent working indicated understanding of the thermomechanical properties of copper and the procedures necessary to achieve desired shapes and hardness levels. The technological sophistication evident in this single artifact provided concrete evidence that copper metallurgy had reached a relatively advanced state in the Alpine region by the mid-4th millennium before the Common Era, with local metalworkers possessing skills sufficient to produce functional tools of high quality that could compete with the finest products of contemporary Eastern Mediterranean metallurgical traditions. The isotopic analysis of the copper from which Ötzi's axe blade was manufactured enabled researchers to investigate the geological provenance of the ore from which this metal derived, contributing to broader understanding of exchange networks and procurement patterns during the European Chalcolithic period. The lead isotope and trace element signatures of the axe blade copper were compared with reference samples from known ore deposits throughout the Alpine region and adjacent areas, with results suggesting derivation from ore sources in southern Tuscany, rather than from Alpine deposits closer to the location where Ötzi's body was discovered. This finding indicated that the copper axe, or the raw copper from which it was manufactured, had travelled considerable distances through exchange networks connecting the Italian peninsula with the Alpine highlands, demonstrating the existence of organised systems for the distribution of metal and metal objects across substantial geographic distances during the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The implications of this provenance determination extended beyond the individual biography of Ötzi's acts to illuminate broader patterns of regional interaction and economic integration during the period when copper metallurgy was establishing itself throughout temperate Europe. The other equipment recovered with Ötzi's body illustrated the hybrid technological systems that characterized this transitional period between predominantly lithic and increasingly metallurgical material cultures. His toolkit included a flint knife with a retouched blade and ashwood handle, a bone awl, a stone scraper, and several unfinished arrow shafts alongside completed arrows with flint projectile points, demonstrating continued reliance on traditional stone-based technologies for applications where these materials remained effective and appropriate. The coexistence of these lithic implements alongside the copper axe within the equipment of a single individual exemplified the gradual and incremental character of technological change during the Chalcolithic period, as communities integrated new materials and techniques into existing technological repertoires without immediately abandoning practices that continued to serve effectively. The selection of materials for different applications within Ötzi's toolkit reflected pragmatic assessment of the properties and availability of various raw materials, with copper employed for the heavy-duty axe blade, where its toughness and edge retention properties conferred advantages, while stone remained the material of choice for projectile points and cutting implements, where its sharpness and ease of manufacture made it preferable despite the availability of metal alternatives. The circumstances surrounding Ötzi's death, which forensic analysis revealed, resulted from an arrow wound to the shoulder, followed by what appeared to be fatal assault while he lay incapacitated, provided evidence for the violent conflicts that characterized some aspects of human interaction during the European Chalcolithic period. The presence of defense wounds on his hands and other evidence of recent combat suggested that Ötzi had been involved in violent confrontations during the final days or hours of his life, while the valuable copper axe remaining with his body indicated that his attackers either fled before completing any robbery or were primarily motivated by objectives other than material acquisition. The violence evident in Ötzi's final moments reflected broader patterns of conflict and competition that archaeological evidence suggested characterized relationships among European Chalcolithic communities, with fortified settlements, weapon development, and skeletal evidence of combat injuries all contributing to pictures of societies in which organized violence represented a recurrent feature of social life. The role of metal objects in these competitive dynamics, whether as weapons whose superior effectiveness could influence the outcomes of violent encounters, or as prestige goods whose possession could attract aggressive attention from those seeking to acquire them through force, remained subject to scholarly investigation that drew upon multiple categories of evidence beyond the single, extraordinary case of Ötzi's preserved remains. The Alpine region where Ötzi lived and died occupied a strategic position within the communication networks connecting Mediterranean and temperate European worlds during the Chalcolithic period, with mountain passes providing routes for the transmission of goods, ideas, and people between these major geographical and cultural zones. The metallurgical traditions that developed in the Alpine region during the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era reflected this intermediate position, combining influences from Italian peninsula sources to the south with connections to Central European cultural developments to the north. The copper ore deposits of the Eastern Alps, which would become major sources of metal production during the subsequent Bronze Age period, were already beginning to attract attention from prospectors and metalworkers during the late Chalcolithic period, with evidence for early exploitation activities providing foundations for the intensive mining and smelting operations that would characterize the region during later centuries. The communities inhabiting these alpine environments developed specialized adaptations to mountain conditions, while maintaining the economic and social connections to lowland societies that enabled participation in broader exchange networks through which metal products circulated alongside other categories of goods. The transmission of metallurgical knowledge and products into the British Isles during the mid-3rd millennium before the Common Era occurred within the context of broader cultural transformations associated with the spread of beaker-associated practices that fundamentally altered the archaeological character of insular communities during this period. The beaker phenomenon, named for the distinctive decorated drinking vessels that constituted its most diagnostic artifact type, encompassed not merely ceramic styles but entire assemblages of material culture, burial practices, and possibly social organisation that spread across substantial portions of Western and Central Europe during the centuries around 2500 to 2200 before the Common Era. The metallurgical component of the beaker assemblage included copper and subsequently bronze artefacts whose forms and manufacturing techniques demonstrated connections to continental metallurgical traditions, while also exhibiting local adaptations and developments that indicated establishment of indigenous metalworking capabilities within the British Isles. The appearance of copper-tanged daggers, flat axes, and various ornament types among the grave goods accompanying beaker burials in Britain and Ireland marked the integration of metal objects into the ceremonial and prestige systems of insular communities, establishing patterns that would intensify during the subsequent early Bronze Age period. The establishment of indigenous copper production in the British Isles required access to local ore sources capable of supporting sustained metallurgical activity beyond the importation of finished products from continental manufacturing centres. The copper ore deposits of Ireland, particularly the extensive mineral formations of the southwestern counties, provided raw materials that would eventually support some of the most intensive prehistoric copper production in northwestern Europe, with the famous mines at Ross Island in County Kerry demonstrating exploitation extending back to the very earliest phases of insular metallurgy, around 2400 before the Common Era. The archaeological investigation of Ross Island revealed evidence for systematic mining operations that extracted copper ore from underground workings reached through vertical shafts, demonstrating organisational capabilities and technical knowledge sufficient for coordinated extraction activities extending beyond casual surface collection of easily accessible minerals. The smelting debris recovered from the vicinity of the Ross Island mines indicated that ore processing occurred in close proximity to extraction sites, reducing the transport requirements for moving heavy ore materials, while concentrating metallurgical waste in locations whose archaeological investigation could illuminate the technical procedures employed by early Irish metalworkers. The technical analysis of copper artefacts from the earliest phases of insular metallurgy revealed distinctive compositional signatures that enabled researchers to trace the development of regional metallurgical traditions and the circulation of products through exchange networks connecting different parts of the British Isles with each other and with continental sources. The copper produced from Irish ore sources exhibited characteristic arsenic and trace element profiles that distinguished it from continental copper and from products manufactured using ore from other insular deposits, providing a compositional fingerprint that could be recognised in artefacts recovered from archaeological contexts throughout Britain and Ireland. The circulation of Irish copper products through exchange networks extending across the Irish Sea and throughout the British mainland demonstrated the integration of insular communities into communication systems of considerable geographic extent, while the development of local metalworking traditions adapted to specific ore sources indicated that metallurgical knowledge had become sufficiently widespread to support production at multiple centres rather than remaining concentrated in single locations, possessing monopolistic control over manufacturing capabilities. The consolidation of metallurgical production across multiple centres throughout the British Isles during the later third millennium before the Common Era represented a fundamental transformation in the technological and social landscape of insular communities, establishing patterns of distributed manufacturing capability that would characterise the subsequent Bronze Age, while simultaneously demonstrating the successful transmission of complex technical knowledge across substantial geographic distances and cultural boundaries. The emergence of metalworking traditions in regions beyond the primary ore sources of southwestern Ireland indicated that the specialised knowledge required for transforming mineral deposits into finished metal products had become sufficiently diffused throughout insular populations to enable independent production wherever suitable raw materials could be accessed, a development that fundamentally altered the economic relationships between communities possessing ore deposits and those dependent upon external sources for their metal supplies. The Great Ore Mines in northern Wales, whose exploitation would eventually create one of the most extensive prehistoric mining complexes in Europe, demonstrated the potential for copper production in regions whose mineral resources had not figured prominently in the earliest phases of insular metallurgy, but whose development during subsequent centuries would contribute substantially to the overall metal supply available to British and Irish communities. The technical requirements for successful copper extraction and processing in these diverse geological environments necessitated adaptive responses to varying ore characteristics, host rock compositions, and local environmental conditions that shaped the specific procedures employed by different metalworking communities, while maintaining the fundamental principles of pyrotechnological transformation that underlay all copper production, regardless of particular circumstances. The social implications of metallurgical dispersal throughout the British Isles extended beyond the immediate economic consequences of distributed production to encompass broader transformations in community organisation, exchange relationships, and the structures of prestige and authority that characterised late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age societies. The control of metallurgical knowledge and production capabilities constituted a potential source of social differentiation in societies where access to metal objects carried symbolic significance beyond their utilitarian functions, creating possibilities for the emergence of specialist metalworkers whose technical expertise distinguished them from the broader population, while also establishing the conditions under which communities possessing productive capabilities might exercise influence over those dependent upon external sources for their metal supplies. The burial evidence from the Beaker period and subsequent early Bronze Age in Britain and Ireland demonstrated the incorporation of metal objects into mortuary practices that expressed social distinctions among the deceased, with the deposition of copper and bronze artifacts in graves serving as material statements about the status, identity, and social connections of individuals whose commemorations incorporated these transformed materials. The grave goods accompanying the famous Amesbury archer, whose burial near Stonehenge around 2300 before the Common Era included some of the earliest metal objects from the British Isles, illustrated the association between metalworking and elite status that characterised the social transformations accompanying the introduction of metallurgy into insular communities, while the isotopic analysis of his skeletal remains indicating Alpine origins demonstrated the mobility of individuals possessing metallurgical connections during this period of technological diffusion. The temporal coincidence between the establishment of metallurgy in the British Isles and the transformation of monument-building traditions that produced the final phases of Stonehenge construction suggested connections between technological change and broader cultural developments whose precise nature remained subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation and interpretation. The Sarsen phase of Stonehenge, involving the transport and erection of massive sandstone blocks whose manipulation required substantial organisational coordination and engineering knowledge, occurred during approximately the same period that witnessed the establishment of insular metallurgical production and the spread of beaker-associated practices throughout the British Isles. The question of whether metallurgical knowledge and the social transformations accompanying its introduction contributed directly to the organisational capabilities enabling such monumental construction, or whether both developments reflected broader processes of social change whose common origins lay in factors not reducible to either technological or ritual domains, remained an area of interpretive discussion that illustrated the complexity of understanding prehistoric cultural transformations through archaeological evidence alone. The absence of direct evidence for metallurgical involvement in monument construction at sites like Stonehenge did not preclude indirect relationships through which technological knowledge, exchange networks, and social organisation associated with metalworking might have influenced the broader context within which monumental activities occurred, suggesting possibilities for connection that could not be definitively established or refuted through available evidence. The transformation of exchange networks accompanying metallurgical dispersal throughout Western Europe during the later third millennium before the Common Era created communication systems of unprecedented geographic extent through which materials, products, knowledge, and potentially populations circulated across distances that would have seemed remarkable to communities of earlier periods whose interactions had been confined to more limited regional scales. The compositional analysis of metal artifacts from this period revealed circulation patterns connecting the British Isles with continental sources in ways that demonstrated sustained long-distance exchange relationships rather than occasional isolated contacts, while the stylistic similarities among artifact types across substantial geographic distances indicated the transmission of aesthetic preferences and manufacturing traditions through networks whose operation required regular communication among participating communities. The amber objects recovered from British beaker burials, whose Baltic origins could be determined through spectroscopic analysis, illustrated the incorporation of insular communities into exchange systems extending across the entirety of northern Europe, connecting regions separated by thousands of kilometres through chains of interaction whose individual links might span relatively short distances while collectively creating connections of continental scope. The integration of metallurgical products into these existing exchange systems provided mechanisms through which copper and bronze artifacts could circulate far beyond their regions of manufacture, while simultaneously creating incentives for the development of local production capabilities that might reduce dependence upon distant sources and enable participation in exchange as producers rather than merely consumers of metal goods. The technological progression from copper to bronze production represented a subsequent phase of metallurgical development, whose origins lay in the discoveries and innovations of the Chalcolithic period, while introducing new complexities of raw material acquisition, alloying procedures, and manufacturing techniques that built upon foundations established during the preceding centuries of copper production. The deliberate addition of tin to copper to produce bronze required access to tin ore sources, whose geographic distribution differed substantially from that of copper deposits, creating new exchange requirements and potentially new patterns of social organisation adapted to the coordination of raw materials from separate locations. The tin sources of Cornwall and Devon in southwestern Britain would eventually become major contributors to the European tin supply during the Bronze Age, their exploitation creating economic relationships of considerable geographic extent, while establishing southwestern Britain as a region of metallurgical significance whose products circulated throughout substantial portions of the continent. The transition from arsenical copper, whose superior working properties compared to pure copper had been recognised and exploited throughout the Chalcolithic period, to tin bronze represented a technological choice whose advantages in terms of casting properties, hardness, and working characteristics eventually established tin bronze as the dominant alloy throughout most of the ancient world, despite the greater rarity of tin compared to the arsenic that had previously served as the principal alloying element. The recognition of the Chalcolithic as a distinct technological and cultural phase, intermediate between the Neolithic and Bronze Age, reflected scholarly understanding that the innovations and transformations occurring during this period possessed sufficient coherence and significance to warrant identification as a discrete developmental stage, rather than mere transitional phenomena subordinate to the adjacent periods of stone and bronze. The conceptual separation of the Chalcolithic from the periods preceding and following it acknowledged that the earliest copper production and utilisation represented achievements worthy of recognition in their own right, not merely preliminary developments, whose significance derived entirely from their role as precursors to subsequent bronze metallurgy. The communities that first discovered the possibilities of metal transformation, that developed the pyrotechnological procedures enabling ore reduction and metalworking, that established the exchange systems through which metallurgical products and knowledge circulated, and that adapted their social organizations to accommodate the new technological capabilities and their implications, accomplished transformations of fundamental importance whose consequences extended throughout subsequent human history, even as the specific forms and techniques they pioneered were superseded by later developments. The stone tools that continued to constitute the majority of utilitarian equipment throughout the Chalcolithic period should not obscure the revolutionary character of the metallurgical innovations occurring simultaneously, any more than the persistence of handwriting in contemporary societies diminishes the transformative significance of digital communication technologies, whose adoption has not eliminated earlier practices, but has fundamentally altered the context within which they occur. The environmental and ecological dimensions of Chalcolithic metallurgical development encompassed consequences extending beyond the immediate transformation of ore into metal, to include broader impacts upon landscapes, forests, and the relationships between human communities and the natural environments they inhabited and exploited. The fuel requirements for sustained smelting operations necessitated access to substantial quantities of charcoal, whose production consumed forest resources at rates that could significantly affect local woodland composition and availability over extended periods of intensive metallurgical activity. The archaeological and paleoecological evidence from regions of concentrated Chalcolithic copper production sometimes revealed patterns of forest clearance and vegetation change that might reflect the cumulative impact of charcoal production for metallurgical purposes, although distinguishing such impacts from those resulting from agricultural expansion and other human activities remained challenging in most contexts. The pollution signatures preserved in peat deposits and ice cores provided complementary evidence for prehistoric metallurgical activity, with elevated concentrations of lead, copper, and other metals in dated sequences, indicating periods of intensified smelting whose atmospheric emissions became incorporated into sedimentary records far from the sites of actual production. The environmental consequences of early metallurgy, though modest compared to the industrial transformations of later periods, established precedents for the anthropogenic modification of atmospheric and ecological conditions that would eventually achieve global significance during subsequent millennia of technological development. The religious and cosmological dimensions of metallurgical practice in Chalcolithic communities remained largely inaccessible to archaeological investigation, yet the transformative character of metal production and the exceptional properties of metallic substances suggested possibilities for symbolic elaboration whose specific forms could only be approached through inference and analogy rather than direct documentation. The transformation of dull-coloured mineral ore into gleaming metallic copper through the application of fire represented an alchemical process whose dramatic character might readily have acquired religious or magical associations in societies whose understanding of physical phenomena differed substantially from modern scientific explanations. The association of metalworking with fire, whose symbolic significance in human religious and cosmological systems extended back to the earliest periods of controlled combustion, suggested possibilities for metallurgical activities acquiring sacred or ritual dimensions that elevated the social position of metalworkers, while simultaneously constraining their activities within frameworks of religious observance and prohibition. The deposition of metal objects in contexts suggesting votive or sacrificial purposes, documented from various Chalcolithic and subsequent Bronze Age contexts, indicated that metal possessed values transcending utilitarian function in ways that might reflect religious conceptions of metallic substances and the transformative processes through which they were produced. The artistic and aesthetic dimensions of Chalcolithic metalwork demonstrated that the communities producing the earliest metal objects recognized and exploited the decorative possibilities of the new medium, developing ornamental traditions that expressed cultural values and aesthetic preferences through the distinctive properties of metallic materials. The surface qualities of polished copper, its capacity for reflecting light, its amenability to decoration through incision, embossing and other techniques, and its potential for coloration through patination or surface treatment, provided artistic resources that metalworkers exploited in creating objects whose visual impact extended beyond their functional purposes. The copper ornaments recovered from Chalcolithic burials and settlement contexts, including the remarkable golden and copper objects from the Varna Cemetery, demonstrated sophisticated appreciation for the decorative potential of metallic materials, whose exploitation required both technical skill in metalworking and aesthetic sensibility in design and execution. The development of distinctive regional styles in metal artifact decoration during the Chalcolithic period indicated the emergence of aesthetic traditions that expressed cultural identities through material media, while simultaneously demonstrating participation in broader networks through which stylistic influences circulated alongside material products and technical knowledge. The population movements and cultural interactions of the later Chalcolithic period encompassed transformations whose genetic and demographic consequences have become increasingly accessible to investigation through the application of ancient DNA analysis to skeletal remains from this crucial transitional phase. The genetic evidence for substantial population replacement in various parts of Europe during the later 3rd millennium before the Common Era, associated with the expansion of steppe-derived ancestry linked to the Yamnaya horizon and its successors, indicated demographic transformations of a magnitude that could not be explained through gradual cultural diffusion alone. The relationship between these population movements and the spread of metallurgical knowledge remained subject to ongoing investigation, with some researchers emphasizing the metallurgical associations of steppe-derived populations whose expansion coincided temporally with the spread of new metallurgical traditions, while others stressed the complexity of cultural transmission processes that could not be reduced to simple equations between population movements and technological change. The beaker phenomenon, whose role in transmitting metallurgical knowledge and practices throughout Western Europe has been discussed previously, appeared to involve both population movements of substantial magnitude and processes of cultural adoption by indigenous communities, whose genetic profiles showed lesser degrees of steppe ancestry, suggesting that the spread of metallurgical traditions involved multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously rather than any single explanatory factor. The culmination of Chalcolithic developments in the transition to the Full Bronze Age represented not an abrupt transformation, but rather a gradual intensification and elaboration of patterns established during the preceding centuries, with the technical distinction between copper and bronze metallurgy marking a convenient conceptual boundary that did not correspond to sharp discontinuities in social organization, exchange systems, or the cultural significance attributed to metallic materials. The communities that participated in the earliest bronze production built upon foundations of metallurgical knowledge, social organization, and exchange relationships established during the Chalcolithic period, adapting and extending existing capabilities rather than replacing them wholesale with entirely novel systems. The persistence of arsenical copper production alongside tin bronze in various regions during the transitional phases illustrated the gradual character of technological change, with older traditions continuing to serve communities whose access to tin sources remained limited or whose established techniques proved adequate for local requirements despite the availability of alternative alloying procedures. The social transformations associated with bronze metallurgy, including intensified social stratification, the emergence of more clearly defined elite groups marked by distinctive burial practices and material possessions, and the development of exchange systems of continental scope, represented elaborations of tendencies already visible during the Chalcolithic, rather than entirely novel developments without precedent in the earlier period. The legacy of Chalcolithic metallurgical innovation extended throughout subsequent human history, establishing technological foundations and social patterns whose consequences persisted long after the specific techniques and materials of the earliest metal production had been superseded by later developments. The fundamental principles of ore reduction through high-temperature processing, the organizational requirements for coordinated raw material acquisition and manufacturing activities, the exchange systems through which specialized products circulated beyond their regions of production, and the social structures adapted to accommodate specialized technical knowledge and its practitioners, all emerged during the Chalcolithic period and continued to shape subsequent technological and social development, regardless of changes in specific materials and techniques. The transformation from societies dependent exclusively upon stone, bone, and organic materials to societies incorporating metals into their technological repertoires represented a transition of fundamental importance, whose consequences extended far beyond the immediate utilitarian advantages of metallic tools and weapons to encompass broader transformations in human relationships with the material world and with each other. The Chalcolithic communities that first accomplished this transformation, working within constraints of knowledge and capability that seem limiting from the perspective of later technological development, achieved innovations whose revolutionary character established new possibilities for human material existence that subsequent generations would exploit, elaborate, and eventually transcend while never entirely escaping the fundamental patterns established during those crucial centuries when copper first emerged from the flames of prehistoric furnaces. The reflection upon the Chalcolithic period from the vantage point of subsequent historical development illuminated both the transformative significance of its innovations and the continuities connecting its achievements with earlier patterns of human adaptation and creativity. The same capacities for observation, experimentation, and problem-solving that had enabled human communities to develop sophisticated lithic technologies, to domesticate plants and animals, and to create complex social organizations adapted to diverse environmental conditions, found new applications in the domain of metallurgical production, where the distinctive properties of metallic materials provided novel challenges and opportunities for human ingenuity. The communities that pioneered copper metallurgy did not represent a new type of humanity endowed with capabilities absent from their predecessors, but rather demonstrated the creative potential inherent in human cognitive and social capacities when confronted with new possibilities whose exploitation required adaptation and innovation. The Chalcolithic achievement lay not in the possession of superior abilities, but in the recognition and realization of possibilities latent within existing human capabilities, possibilities whose actualization required the specific circumstances of environmental opportunity, accumulated prior knowledge, and social organization that converged in the particular times and places where metallurgical innovation first occurred. The archaeological investigation of the Chalcolithic period continued to reveal new dimensions of complexity and significance in the earliest phases of human metallurgical development, with ongoing research expanding understanding of technological procedures, social organization, and cultural significance in ways that enriched appreciation for for the achievements of prehistoric metalworking communities. The application of new analytical techniques to archaeological materials enabled increasingly precise characterization of metallurgical products or sources and manufacturing procedures, while excavation of additional sites expanded the geographic and temporal range of documented Chalcolithic activity. The integration of archaeological evidence with data from related disciplines including geology, environmental science, and population genetics provided increasingly comprehensive frameworks for understanding the contexts within which metallurgical innovation occurred and the consequences that flowed from its adoption. The Chalcolithic period, once treated as a poorly defined transitional phase between the better understood Neolithic and Bronze Age, had emerged through sustained scholarly attention as a period of transformative significance whose innovations established foundations for subsequent technological and social development, while simultaneously representing achievements worthy of recognition and appreciation in their own right. The copper that first flowed from those ancient furnaces in the highlands of Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, that circulated through the exchange networks of Tel Halaf and Ubaid communities, that accompanied Ötzi on his final journey through the Alpine passes, and that eventually reached the Atlantic shores of Iberia and the islands of Britain, represented more than mere material whose utilitarian properties distinguished it from the stone tools it partially replaced. The transformation of mineral ore into gleaming metal embodied human capacity for manipulating the natural world in ways that transcended the immediate modification of existing materials to achieve the creation of substances whose properties had no direct precedent in the unprocessed environment. The metallurgical revolution of the Chalcolithic period demonstrated that human communities possessed capabilities for transforming their material circumstances that extended beyond the adaptation to existing conditions to encompass the generation of genuinely novel possibilities whose exploitation opened developmental pathways unavailable to societies lacking metallurgical knowledge and capability. The communities that inhabited the Chalcolithic world, spanning from the 5th millennium through the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and extending from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic shores of Western Europe, accomplished transformations whose consequences extended throughout subsequent millennia of human history, establishing technological and social patterns that would be elaborated, modified, and eventually transcended while never entirely losing the fundamental character imparted during those crucial centuries when humanity first learned to draw metal from stone through the transformative agency of fire.